شيكت لحظة
لايف
تليفون
لايف لايف لايف
It's fine.
ها؟ ايه جوش كان
نفس الشخصيات. لا 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 عندك اتصال بينه واتصل بيها ما توصل بس شوي بتوصل.
Friends and partners in our work to strengthen human rights for the sake of a better world, a world in which justice, truth, equality, freedom, and dignity prevail. On behalf of Al-Qasd for Human Rights, I would like to welcome you today to our annual conference for 2020. Friends, Al-Qasd annual conference is an opportunity for all of us to meet, talk and discuss the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Gulf. It is also a priceless opportunity to meet all of the activists and experts we have participating in the conference, whether in person or online. Today's proceedings are divided to 3 sessions. The first will be about the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia. The second about the human rights situation in the Gulf more generally, and the final sessions will be tackled strategies for securing accountability. Before we go any further, I would like to remember someone who remains and always will be very dear to our hearts and minds. The courageous Emiratis activist Ala Al-Siddiq, who tragically passed from this world in June this year. We dedicate this conference to her memory and in recognition to her tireless efforts in the cause of justice. Ala was behind the launching of Al-Qasd Arabian Peninsula Unit by covering human rights development in other states of the region. In honor of Ala and tackling forward this splendid idea for hers, the unit has been renamed to the Ala Al-Siddiq Unit. Now, I would like to leave you with this short video about Ala. Thank you for watching, and let us now get our first session underway with my colleague, Al-Qas Deputy Director Josh Cooper, in the chair. Thank you.
مش معك.
For the introduction and fitting words about Allah. Welcome to you all to the first session of this 2021 annual conference. It's great to see some of you in person, and thank you for those joining online as well. Al-Qas has traditionally held its annual conference on this day in recent years, on Human Rights Day. And this conference, as well as the annual report that we published at the start of the year, has sort of served to take stock of human rights developments in Saudi Arabia and has highlighted the deteriorating situation in recent years. I recall the 2018 Al-Qas conference was titled "The Decline in Human Rights in the New Saudi Arabia," i.e. under King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And the 2019 conference, which was also held here at Front Club, pointed to a human rights crisis. This time last year, 2020, there was quite a lot of spotlight on Saudi Arabia as it hosted the G20 summit, and this led to quite a lot of international criticism. This, alongside the prospect of the new US administration, seemed to be moving towards a sense of growing pressure on Saudi Arabia and some hope for progress this year. And indeed, we did see some positive developments at the start of the year, such as the release of several women's rights activists. That has attention on Saudi Arabia diminished somewhat as the G20 came to a close. We've seen human rights violations in Saudi Arabia really renewed with a sense of vigor, with harsh prison sentences handed down to human rights defenders.
يقول خليه يعطي المايك حتى باعتماد في يد جورج. وين المايك حق
So without further ado, to discuss some of these issues and more, let me introduce a terrific panel joining online from the US. We have who is a Saudi academic and activist and research director for the Gulf. Research Director for the Gulf at Democracy for the Arab World Now, Dawn, as well as co-founder and General Secretary of the National Assembly Party, NAS, Saudi Arabia's first openly declared political party. As well as from the US, we have Bethany Al-Qaidi, Saudi Officer at Freedom Initiative, who also holds a PhD in international human rights law, focused on Saudi Arabia, and recently successfully defended her PhD. So congratulations to her. You can see her now on the screen. Hello, Abdullah. Hello, Bethany. And here in London, we are delighted to have Lena. The NAS party of Jane Saudi women's rights activist, and Lena recently co-authored the book Jane Dreams of the Sunflowers about the sister story. Last but not least, we have Yahya, Saudi activist and founder of Repression, and a trustee who is also co-founder and former general secretary of the NAS party. So we'll first hear from each of the four speakers, and then allow some time for question and answer from the audience here and with you online. So I will first go to one of our guests online, and Abdullah Al-Awda. Thank you so much for joining in your role at Dawn, as well as the NAS party as newly elected General Secretary. So congratulations to you. You're at the heart of advocacy efforts on human rights in Saudi Arabia. How, as we approach the closing of another year, how do you assess the general situation on the ground in the country?
Thank you so much for inviting me to such great conference. I'm happy to be with such esteemed colleagues and great speakers. Well, as you guys all know, the situation in Saudi Arabia has never been great, and the Saudi system has never been democratic. But the thing is that since Mohammed bin Salman ascended to the position of crown prince and became the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, the situation of human rights has been deteriorating, and it went from bad to worse. And because of all the things that he was able to do in order to accumulate power, he was able also to do damage that nobody else was able to do in such a short time of period, in such a short period. And then human rights, from the human rights perspective, he went beyond attacking activists, feminists, scholars, to even involve their families. And he went beyond, for example, attacking one person or one individual to attacking whole tribes, like what he did to Al-Huwaitat, for example. So we have seen these phenomena where he did the collective damage and the collective punishment, and sometimes it's not even a punishment, it's just a collective damage to a whole tribe or whole region or whole city. And we have seen that the same scenario being used over and over in other cities of Saudi Arabia. We have seen how the travel ban, for example, is being excessively used against families, against activists, against his own family, by the way. And we have seen how also the current system of Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Salman as a crown prince have used all the power and all the energy, all the resources of the country to also harass dissidents and activists abroad. So also, again, it's not a new, it's not totally new phenomenon for other rulers and previous rulers to try to harass activists outside. But what Mohammed bin Salman did is he took it to another level, and we all know the incident of assassinating Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. So this just tells you about using the embassies to harass dissidents. And we have seen how the Saudi embassy here in Washington, D.C. Spied on students, on activists, how they try to even harass them, ask them to go back to the country, how all embassies around the world are being used to do such harm. And the other example is the embassy in Norway, the Saudi embassy in Norway, how they try to how they were being used to do horrific acts, like trying to track down Iyad al-Baghdadi, and how they also used the embassy here in Washington, D.C. and in Canada to try to harm Saad al-Jabri and try to harm Umar Abdulaziz. So all of these examples show you the level, the amount, and also the nature of the development of how the Saudi government is harassing, jailing, arresting, trying to assassinate, or even assassinating, like in the case of Khashoggi, activists abroad, and not even activists, sometimes their families, and loved ones, like we have seen outside and inside the country. And in just recent, in a recent piece at the Washington Post, they actually assessed the number of people under travel ban as thousands or even tens of thousands in Saudi Arabia, which is like a huge number. I think that when Mohammed bin Salman, for example, in 2019, when he admitted, he said about like 3,500 people are detainees. Probably he meant political detainees. I think the number even larger than this, but just admitting that number by itself is actually outrageous. The level of people who are being arrested just for tweeting or saying a word. And I'm going to end with this. So if you see and look at all of these things and you think, well, this has changed or reforms are being implemented, we'll look at the recent examples, and you just have a quick look at the reports of the Al-Qist and the people who were arrested on a daily basis. And the most recent example that I have in mind is the report that we just had about Saud al-Sarhan, who is, and why is this an important example? Because Saud is working for the government. He was employed by the royal court. He has been heading the research center, King Faisal Research Center in Riyadh, and he has never criticized the government or said any bad word about it, either publicly or privately. And he does not have a Twitter account, because we know Twitter is like a platform where the Saudi government picked up a lot of people and arrested them. So he has all these things, and nevertheless, he was arrested. And we didn't know, of course, the details of why and the circumstances, but we know that if Saud al-Sarhan, in such a position, in such an environment with such a background, was arrested, then everybody is vulnerable. Thank you so much.
Succinct overview of the scope and scale of the situation in Saudi Arabia. And I'll go now to someone here in person in London, and Lina Al-Hadloul. You have campaigned relentlessly for the freedom of your sister Lujain, who was conditionally released earlier this year. Now, on the matter of women's rights, there's been quite a lot of coverage on the supposed reforms related to women's rights in Saudi Arabia. How would you assess the situation on the ground for women in Saudi Arabia at the moment?
Thank you, Josh. Can you hear me? I don't think it works. Yeah? Okay. And thank you, Abdullah. So, as Josh said, my name is Lina Al-Hadloul. I'm the sister of Lujain Al-Hadloul. I am now an activist and also member of the National Assembly Party. So my activism began after my sister's arrest. I didn't have anything to do with this before. But I actually realized that it's now or never to save the country, that we need more activists. So first, I will maybe just give a little recap of why my sister was arrested. So my sister was, it's a difficult question now, a women's rights activist. She campaigned for the Women to Drive campaign and also to end the male guardianship system. So what's important to know is that she got arrested a couple of weeks before the driving ban was to be lifted. And so it was also during that time that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was applauded everywhere for the reforms he had announced. So what was the situation at that time? Women, everyone in the international community that knew that women were had a terrible situation in Saudi Arabia, and it was criticized publicly. So basically, there's the male guardianship system, meaning that women are considered as minors till the end of their lives, and they need the consent of either their husband, their father, or sometimes their son, for every important decision in their lives. They couldn't drive at that time. There's also the women who are victims of domestic violence are just put in, they call it a care home, but it's basically a prison because they don't have the keys to leave it. They their calendar is scheduled as the direction wants it, etc., etc. And then Mohammed bin Salman comes in this game, and he says he will reform the country and he will give women rights, which actually, some changes were positive. Allowing women to drive was the right thing to do. But we have to see broader than this, and we have to see the whole situation. So when it comes to the male guardianship system, for example, it's still in place. If the man that turned the country to a police state, he turned it to a one-man rule state, and that he takes all these decisions. If he wanted, to really give women their rights, he would have abolished the system. But it's clearly not his intention, because he knows that repression is structural, and that if he, gives rights to one part of the population, the people will want more, and they will ask for their rights, and this is not what he wants. So literally all the reforms that he has made, including some of the women's rights changes, are only to hide to strengthen his position, because it doesn't change anything politically to where he is at the moment, but also to hide the real situation inside of the country, which is basically that everyone has been muzzled. There is no civil society at all. Everyone expressing their opinions is either silenced with travel bans, imprisoned, killed, cut into pieces. And so there's literally not one independent voice now in the country. And so some people will tell me, honestly, they tell me that we as Saudis need such a strong man for reforms to take place. And I answer them, I tell them, okay, if you think so, but then tell me why in this, talking about women's rights, why it didn't change anything to have such a man. We see, for example, that the male guardianship system is still here. Feminism, after Mohammed bin Salman came to power, was considered as a crime, and later on it was deleted. The tweet where they announced it as a crime, they deleted it because there was international outrage. We see also, for example, that what they tell me is that now we have women ambassadors. I tell them, but these women are they work for the government. They have too much interest. And I will tell you a personal experience is that the second woman ambassador in Saudi Arabia is Amal al-Muallimi. She was part of the Human Rights Commission that visited my sister in prison. My sister got tortured in prison by the right-hand man of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And my sister trusted her. She told her everything that had happened to her. And then she told her, but before leaving me, can you just promise me that you can help me, or you can do something about it? And she told her literally right to her face, I cannot do anything to you. The problem is bigger than me. And she left. And of course, my sister felt betrayed. And then we find out a couple of days later that the Human Rights Commission denies that there was torture in prison, and she gets promoted as an ambassador. So all of this, what I'm saying is all the changes that we see are not reforms. They're merely changes to hide abuses in the country. And the only thing that will allow reforms inside of the country is when reformers can speak. You cannot have one man reforming a country. You need the people to be part of this change. And so my message today is that let's not be fooled by big narratives of change, as long as you cannot speak to the people inside of the country. And you know it, journalists know that when they go inside of Saudi Arabia, they're not allowed to speak to activists. They know that Lujain and all the other activists have been, denied access to journalists. They know that any independent voice now is, impossible to reach. So why would you believe the narrative of a man telling you that everything is changing and going in the right direction? So I'm just saying that whoever is listening, we are now, I think, and I'm very positive actually, after everything I said, I'm very positive for the future of Saudi Arabia, because I think the younger generation are conscious about the importance of their voice. They know that they can be part of the change, even though it's dangerous for them. So I want to say, protect us, give our names when you know that someone is in prison, campaign for the release, try to reach out to them, even though it's not possible to reach out to them. Ask the embassies, the embassies in the countries you are in, that you'd like to reach out to this person in Saudi. Try to have some direct contact to the Saudi people instead of always reaching out to the regime. And part of this is also, give legitimacy to popular initiatives, including the National Assembly Party. And we think that it's possible, to, even though we have such a strong man leading the country, that we can be a counterpower to it, but we need the people to support us and to listen to us as well. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Lina. I'm sure there's more we'll come back to later on, including the news yesterday, which you shared. But next to go to another of our guests online, and Bethany Al-Haidari. Bethany, hello. In your roles, including with Freedom Initiative, you work very closely with those who have been wrongly detained and targeted by the Saudi authorities. What have been some of the main trends of late that you've been monitoring in your work?
Sure. Thank you guys for having me here. And it's an honor to be alongside these brave and brilliant colleagues. And thanks again to Qust for the invitation and for the fantastic work that you continue to do in this space. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a pleasure to speak on the current status on the ground in Saudi Arabia or on human rights in Saudi Arabia, because quite frankly, the status on the ground is tragic. But I do think it's worth taking a moment to identify and recognize some of the propaganda tactics and damaging narratives about the law, about reform and human rights that are currently being deployed by the Saudi government, and unfortunately being absorbed and often regurgitated by international analysts, journalists, celebrities, athletes, diplomats, and even some well-paid politicians. What's on the ground completely contradicts that narrative. When it comes to barriers to human rights in Saudi Arabia, there's been this long-standing tactic, as Lina has identified, of placing the blame for the lack of progress on Saudi society. And the government sort of portrays itself as this victim to society, using the same example, I would say, that's familiar to the global community, the ban on women driving, which was in place until 2018. During the period when women were prohibited to drive, I can think of a couple incidents where, for example, the Saudi Foreign Minister Adel Jubeir at the Munich Security Council said that it was a societal issue, and the people would resolve it in their own time, in their own way. The same story was in 2016 when Mohammed bin Salman was introducing Boston Consulting Group's infamous Vision 2030. And when MBS was questioned by journalists when women would be permitted to drive, he said that society would decide, not the government. The first obvious problem with that argument is that the country is an absolute monarchy and society doesn't get a say. In fact, in that specific context, like you can see from Lina's presence today, activists like Lujain Al-Hadloul, Aziz Al-Yusuf, Iman Al-Nafjan, and several more did decide that it was time for women to drive and organized to accomplish that. And they were detained, tortured, and charged as criminals and terrorists. And they remain in Saudi Arabia today, forcibly entrapped in the country and unsafe. I think the first point of departure when we're speaking about the reality on the ground, and I say this extra loud for the international community, who, by the way, is complicit in perpetuating these abuses, is that Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy, as it's been said, and people on the ground cannot speak freely. They have to self-censor. And the only narrative that we're getting from the ground is the governments. That's why it is so important to listen to the people like my colleagues here on the panel who are able to speak to the realities on the ground. And even myself, who spent nearly a decade conducting ethnographic research, observing, and was deeply integrated into society through my family. One of the last arguments that Jamal Khashoggi made before he was killed was calling out Mohammed bin Salman's flawed narrative of saying that, allegedly Saudi citizens somehow are not ready for democracy. And when Jamal challenged that narrative, well, he was brutally murdered. And he's the example that is known, but there are countless others who've tried to say the same and have been silenced, tortured, detained, and killed. The only reason that we really think of the Saudi Arabian government as any different from the governments of North Korea or Iran is because of money, a lot of which goes to propaganda to improve and whitewash the country's image. That includes bringing athletes and celebrities like Justin Bieber and Alicia Keys and Imagine Dragons to perform in the country as if all is well. And because governments like my own have declared Saudi Arabia a strategic partner and are willing to turn a blind eye to egregious loss of life in Saudi and especially in Yemen, which has suffered tremendously in the Saudi-led war, in order to maintain a political and economic status quo. So what is the reality on the ground? Well, in my capacity at the Freedom Initiative, I do have the honor of working with dozens of Saudi families. And because our work is US-based, the majority of the people that we work with have some tie to the United States and are considered US persons, either citizens, LPRs, or former residents of the US who are detained and have loved ones perhaps that are in excruciatingly inhumane circumstances for daring to speak. I can think of most recently, Abdulrahman Sadhan, the humanitarian aid worker who last appeared in court several months ago with visible body deformations due to the torture that he suffered while in detention. Well, he was recently sentenced to 20 years in jail and a 20-year travel ban to follow. It is separated from his family in the US. He's disappeared since, and nobody has heard from him. I can think of Mohammed al-Kahtani, who remains in detention for starting a civil society organization that peacefully called for civil and political rights for Saudi, or his colleague, Dr. Abdullah Hamid, who died in 2020 after medical neglect in prison. Now, these don't just impact Saudi citizens on the ground. It should matter to all of us, especially given the support to Western governments to provide in upholding the regime. This year, we even had a case of a US citizen tourist who was detained and tortured at the airport for helping asylum seekers in the United States. There was another US citizen tourist who was detained in a women's center that Lena had mentioned that you can't get out of. And while she was in there, her partner used the opportunity to kidnap her child from her, a US citizen. There's some 89 US persons detained or on travel ban in Saudi for calling for human rights at the moment. And beyond this, there's 47 American citizen women and children who, like myself, at one point in time, are currently trapped due to male guardianship and kafala laws. And the majority of them are victims of domestic violence and abuse. But beyond that, there are thousands of Filipinos, Indians, Kenyans, Sri Lankan, Ethiopian workers who are guests in the country, but end up being subject to extreme discrimination on the basis of their national origin, who've been detained, beaten, abused, forced into prostitution or forced labor, who have no legal remedy. The human rights situation in Saudi Arabia impacts the entire world. And from my experience of 8 years academic research on the ground to nearly 2 years working directly with victims on the ground from outside, it's not gotten any better. And when we speak of human rights in Saudi Arabia, it's really important to remember that the legal system in Saudi Arabia is not set up with the goal of upholding justice or protecting rights of citizens or residents in their jurisdiction. It is a system and a tool of repression set in place that's not independent, it's not impartial, but it's set up with the sole goal of maintaining the regime. So it's not even a rational law. And this can't be considered law in its most basic form. So I think all of us on the panel have had to leave behind our lives in Saudi Arabia in emergency circumstances. We've been forced for our safety to some degree to have to fight to being returned. But from outside, we continue to fight the right to dignity, safety, and freedom for everyone on the ground. And I would just reiterate, and I'm honored to be here supporting that voice like Lena has called for. And I think that it's an honor to be here today, and we all are hoping and fighting for a better Saudi Arabia for all. Thank you.
Anthony, for sharing the damning findings of Freedom Initiative's latest report and your powerful words. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of the points raised later on too, including the role of the US administration. And but lastly, but not least, I'll come to Yahya Asiri. Yahya, you've heard from our three great panelists, so I'll maybe just give you the floor to hear your reaction and anything you'd like to say.
Thank you very much, Josh, and thank you very much for the team of Al-Qist. I'm not of the team, and for the great speakers, for the audience, whether here or behind the screens. I think in summary, the situation in Saudi Arabia is going from worse to worse, as Abdullah described. And in the opposite side, the reputation for Mohammed bin Salman also going from worse to worse. Before the murder for Jamal Khashoggi, when we talk to people about the violations in Saudi Arabia, all of them, they keep telling us that's his reform, he wants to do reform. After the murder for Jamal Khashoggi, I think the criticism against Mohammed bin Salman and against the Saudi authority showed the world lots of violations inside Saudi Arabia. But now, with these days, they know he is dictator, they know he's not a reformer, but they want to keep their profits and their relation and their interest in the country. And I believe, yes, we have always conflict between the interest and the values, especially the human rights values. But with our work, we need to push forward and to push those politicians, whether they are in the dictator countries like our dictators, or in these countries who claim they are supporting the human rights and they like the democracy. We want to keep pushing them to enhance our values. Otherwise, if we be silent, the violations will be increased. Look, when we have little bit quiet media in the last few months, Macron, he was brave enough to travel to Saudi Arabia and to meet Mohammed bin Salman, and it was the first meeting in this level after the murder for Jamal Khashoggi, and he will normalize the relation with Mohammed bin Salman now again, and he will encourage another leaders in Europe and maybe in the United States to meet with Mohammed bin Salman again. If we keep trying to make Macron himself to pay the price for this help for the dictator regime in Saudi Arabia, other dictators or other leaders around the world, they will feel it difficult to do the same. If we can do our best with the media, especially in France, and with the NGOs there in France, and with the opposition parties in France, to make Macron pay the price for the normalizations with Mohammed bin Salman, that will make, for example, Boris Johnson feel difficult to go and visit Saudi Arabia and to meet with Mohammed bin Salman like Macron. If not, they will feel free to keep normalizing the relation, and thus will enhance the violations again. The situation also, there's one thing maybe people, they are not noticed. We are talking about the violations when it's happened at the moment, but later on, people will forget. And this is maybe the game for the dictators. As example, they arrested ACPRA members. When they arrested ACPRA members, they feel it is difficult, and the trial for ACPRA members took long time, and it was difficult for the regime to arrest them. But when they arrested them, there's lots of pressure on the regime, but they sentenced them for 10 years, 15 years, very long time in the prisons. And we as human rights defenders and NGOs trying to find the hook to talk about them. We are trying to find something to talk about them. Okay, this guy, he's in hunger strike. Let's come and talk to him. This is the birthday for this guy. But in the normal days, they are behind the bars, suffering behind the bars, suffering from torture, from early treatment, from everything. And the dictators, they throw them there, and the world be silent. Yes, we can brought the cases in front of the media for some time, but most of the time they are silent, the human rights defenders. How can we have reform? How can we have awareness even inside the country when the regime keeps saying to people, our people, they don't want democracy. And as Lena said, and Abdullah and Bethany, the people, they are the decision maker and the people. They don't want the women to drive, and when they're ready, we will allow them. But never the people, the society. They never took anyone to the prison because women drove the car, or the people defending the human rights or asking for human rights, or they want the reform. The regime taking them to the prisons. That's mean the regime, they don't want any reform. What they want to have Formula One and events and cinema and these things as to wash the violations and to make people forget about the violations and to give like a hook for the allies for the regime to say, look, he's a reformer. Unfortunately, some human rights defenders, some people defending or believe in human rights and democracy in the media, and some organization defending the human rights, also they have been fallen by that. And we have seen some reports saying there is a reform, but it is not enough. Where is the reform? Yeah, there is something positive, but it is not enough. Nothing positive. I'm not trying to say to be very trying to attacking the regime without a reason. The only thing that we got allowing women to drive, and this is after very, very long pressure, and it is not from the regime, it is from the human rights defenders. They paid the price to allow women to drive, and they make all of that pressure around the world until they pressure the regime to allow women to drive. And the regime at that moment was really under pressure, and the evidence for that, the regime arrested the women rights defenders because they pressured them to allow women to drive. If you want to do that as a reform, you must go to the human rights defenders and say sorry for what's happened in the past years. We are not agree with what's happened. That was mistake when the regime banned the women from drive, and now we will allow women to drive, and they will release all people in prison from the past, like Mohammed Fahd al-Qahtani, Walid Abul Khair, Ala Brunji, all of these prisoners, they already in prisons because they defended this right. But what's happened when they allow women to drive? They arrested everyone. He already defends the rights to stop them defending any other rights, because they know if that's a success and the credits go for the human rights defenders, they will continue to demand another rights. And this is what they are trying to stop us from. As Lena mentioned, the first step for reform to allow people to express their opinion. Unfortunately, lots of people around the world talking about our society and telling us about our society. Do you think the society is ready for democracy? We don't think they are ready for democracy. We believe if there is collapse in your country, they will fight each other. How can you know? Our reformers and our people and the brave people, they can't talk. They are behind the bars. And people outside the prisons, they are forced to say something in favor for the regime. And also I have seen lots of journalists and people wrote about Saudi Arabia and covered stories in Saudi Arabia. And they did it wrongly. When I asked them, they said, we traveled to Saudi Arabia and we have seen people happy in Saudi Arabia. Really? How can you know they are happy? They forced to say that. Nobody in Saudi Arabia in the street able to tell you the truth. Nobody. But because some people, they grow up with the freedom countries and they are free to say what they want to say in the country. And when they travel to Saudi Arabia, they don't understand the situation and they believe it's the same. And they ask people and the young generation, are you happy with the cinema? Are you happy with these events? Are you happy with the Formula One? They said, yeah, we are happy, because there is no choice. The choice is to say happy or happy or happy. There's nothing else. So the journalists, they cover it and they will write 2,000 words article. At the end, they will have a quotation from me or from another human rights defender to say this is not true, and that's it. And they'll say we tried to make balance. Where is the balance? So this is the situation. We want to be aware of it. It is really complicated, but we still have people, human rights defenders, journalists, people, they really understand what they are doing proper research before they are writing or talking about Saudi Arabia, and understanding the situation very well. And they are not being fallen by the narrative saying, okay, let's be in the middle, saying there is positive and there is something negative. If there is 90 mistake and you just pick one, and there is only one thing positive and you pick this one, you make it 50-50. And you have blind eyes about lots of mistakes and violations. So this is not in the middle. So this is, I think, the most important thing we want to pressure or want to work on, because while we keep these stories and these violations in the scene, that will make the situation, I'm not saying better, but at least not like what is it now. Anytime the media, the NGOs, the human rights defenders, they are not talking enough about the violations, the situation going worse immediately. And if there is pressure, always there is hope, at least hope. I'm not saying change, but at least there is a hope. And some change, small change, but there is. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Yahya. And we'll soon go to question and answers from the audience here. So get thinking of any questions. I'll maybe just ask a quick question myself before we go to that. And so we alluded earlier to on the question of justice and accountability efforts, and we'll have more time to discuss that later on in the session. But one piece of news I'd like to ask about is, which you shared about yesterday, Lina, about a court case opened in America around the case of your sister and a company, Dark Matter, who hacked her phone while she was at Emirates, and which led to her arrest. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how this came about and what it says about how the fight for justice for Lujain is much ongoing?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, I wanted to talk about it, but I forgot. So yes, so Lujain, when during all the process, when she was without charges, and when they started the trial in Saudi Arabia, and then they transferred her to the terrorism court, etc., she always wanted to really use the legal means she had in Saudi. And she and it's quite funny. I mean, we published everything on our website, lujainalhadlul.org, and you can see her defense. She really she has maybe and thank you, Sue, for the translation. And so it's Lujain's defense is more than 10 pages, and then the public prosecution answers with literally a paragraph saying that everything you said is not true. And you see that they don't take this seriously. And so Lujain, even after being released, she still appealed against the sentencing of 5 years and 8 months and the travel ban. And then she went to the highest court. And so once she saw that there was no way for the legal procedures inside of the country to bring justice, she also said, okay, I mean, the crimes that I've been subjected to are transnational. Lujain was kidnapped from the Emirates. She was brought to Saudi Arabia, and in Saudi Arabia she was imprisoned and tortured. Noting that the people who helped the Emirates to kidnap her was the fact that she was hacked before that and tracked on her phone. And this hacking was made by American officials, security officials who worked for the Emirates. So we see that almost the whole world was, against her. And not only my sister, she's just a symbol of it, because she's still trying to publicly, seek justice. But she's not the only one who has been hacked. Yahya himself, has been hacked. And she's not also the only one who has been kidnapped from the Emirates. But so now that she is in Saudi Arabia, that the legal, the internal legal procedures are over, she still wants to somehow, get justice. So she is suing Dark Matter, the spyware company in the US. And it's actually an interesting case, because there was already a case against the same people who how do you say this? maybe I need you to. When when a legal case, you say that it's true, but then you just pay money and say, okay, stop prosecuting me. I settled, exactly. Yes. Okay. So the case has been settled, and so they don't deny anything they've done. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And so they don't deny anything they were accused of, and so the case is against people who are agreeing on the fact that they worked for the Emirates, and that the Emirates also afterwards kidnapped and imprisoned activists. So let's see how this goes. But just to say that Lujain doesn't only do it for herself. She knows that. And that's what we were discussing, and that's what I tell everyone, is that now that she's out of prison and that she got all the support she feels like she has some kind of responsibility to continue, because if she doesn't do it, no one will get the light she got now. So now that she got the light, she wants also to continue the fight. Otherwise, it's dead, and it's almost like she's losing everything. And she owes it to the community that was supporting her. So. And again, I think on her behalf also, thank you everyone for the support from the start. It's incredible. And thank you, Yahya, for her qist. And yes, so she's suing it, and other things are coming up also. Stay tuned.
Thanks very much for sharing about that, Lina. And I think, real testament to your strength and of your sister and whole family and other activists in your position, and a reminder, as Bethany said earlier, of these violations in Saudi Arabia, which have real international implications. And so there are many steps we can do in different jurisdictions, which we'll talk about later as well in the conference. We've got about 15 minutes to go of this first session. So now might be a good time to open up to the floor if there are any questions from those in the audience here. Thank you very much for being here, as well as anyone online who can drop a comment or, thank you.
I have a question for our guests in the US in particular, Bethany and Abdullah. The US, I think last week, passed a defense budget bill, 768 billion. And there was a proposal in there which was to impose sanctions on the team which was accused of assassinating Jamal Khashoggi. So that's been now withdrawn. So now, given Biden came in with so much promise, human rights first agenda. I mean, what do you make of that? Bethany in particular, maybe you've been following this, and Abdullah yourself. What do you make of that? I mean, it just seems like a U-turn from what he pledged initially to pull this really minor bill, you'd think. It's not really a massive thing to achieve. So what do you make of that? And are you disappointed in the direction the Trump administration, the Biden administration? It is a Trump policy. It is more or less a Trump thing to do, isn't it? Biden has undertaken. Thank you.
Yeah, that's some people say, like Biden administration worked like a Trump administration or something. So go ahead, Bethany. Sorry.
Yeah, that was definitely a disappointment, I will say. But there's been quite a few letdowns and disappointments, but unfortunately, I don't think that's very different from the status quo. What I do think was like an abuse of discretion here was that there was a window of opportunity when we were switching from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, when I think there was a bit of fear on the Saudi side, and we saw a few of the U.S. citizens released while that transition was happening in anticipation of Biden's following through on his promises on the campaign route. I think the American political history has made it quite normal for politicians to say one narrative on the campaign ground, and then unfortunately it doesn't follow through. There's a lot of changes that need to happen, and that was a major disappointment. But on the other end, I will say that there is some pretty positive legislation that has made some moves as well this year, including the Protection of Saudi Dissidents Act. That's Rep. Connolly's bill that did pass the House. It's obviously got some work to go in getting towards the Senate, but I would say that there is a new shift in Congress that is very much holding accountable the Saudi government. But as far as the administration goes, it's this business as usual, unfortunately. And I would have liked to see some of those promises on the campaign trail come through, but so far we're still waiting.
Yeah, if I can add anything, I mean, thank you. That was really, I mean, accurate. If I may add anything, it's that when Biden came to the administration, he promised a lot of things, of course, but he did a few things. There are positive things that we should highlight. So one was the releasing of the ODNI report. I think that was a good step, and we applauded it. We thought it's a good step toward transparency, but we wanted to, and we asked to follow that with a step of accountability, meaning to follow that with sanctions against those who involved, according to the same report in the Khashoggi murder. So that was one thing that we should highlight. Another thing was freezing what they called the offensive weapons, selling offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia. I think that was also a good step. So all the discussion now is about something that the Biden administration called defensive weapons, kind of weapons that would all be, according to them, be used to defend Saudi Arabia, but not attack people outside Saudi Arabia, meaning like in Yemen. I mean, I thought that was, I mean, we thought, I think a lot of us thought that was a good step forward. We still need like a lot of work because we think also like weapons are weapons. It's there. I mean, the dichotomy differentiating between like defensive and offensive was just created to allow, you know, these arms sales to happen and to go. And the third thing, I think, as Bethany mentioned, was at the very beginning, releasing some prisoners. Lujain is an example. The Americans are another example. And you know, also the fear that MBS had, and you know, it's important at that time. We had a great opportunity to use that and exploit it, and the American administration had a great opportunity to use it to get a lot of leverage and a lot of you know, things from the Saudi government in regard to human rights, but unfortunately they didn't, and they blew it over and over. But the fourth thing that I think we should also highlight, and it's a positive step also, it's the symbolic step of dealing with the Saudi government. Of course, so what they promised was a huge, great things, but what they did was like humble steps toward that we need to acknowledge, but also we need to push for like a real change on the ground. And the symbolic step I meant was when Biden administration said the counterpart of Biden is King Salman, not Mohammed bin Salman, and he did not meet with Mohammed bin Salman. I mean, despite all the pressure, despite the oil prices, despite a lot of things. Does that mean that they are in great shape? Of course not. Does that mean that everything is good? No. But of course, we have a lot of criticisms against Biden administration on all of these things. But I think we did like the first step, and there are a lot of steps ahead that we need to take and push the administration to do in order to reach some level. But of course, the promise was like, wow, and then what they did was way below and behind. But they did some steps at least.
Hi, yeah, thanks to all the panelists for your fantastic presentations. I mean, I guess we're now 3 years on from the death of Jamal Khashoggi, and I wondered if I could. This may be to any of the panelists. I wonder if you can reflect a bit on looking back after 3 years, and especially as the kind of diplomatic isolation of Mohammed bin Salman is maybe kind of now coming to an end, as Yahya referenced. I wonder if you could reflect on what was the impact in terms of the practice of the government, in terms of the sort of crackdown. Did that enormous controversy and international kind of international criticism, did it have any effect, positive or negative, like in terms of the practices, the patterns, the intensification of crackdown on human rights defenders and civil society and other critics? I've seen some commentaries sort of suggesting that internationally or regionally it may have had some kind of deterrent impact and reduced the kind of destabilizing behavior that we'd seen in, from Mohammed bin Salman in Lebanon or Qatar. And I wondered if there was any negative or positive trend that you'd seen, inside the country.
Do you want to address the question first?
Maybe should we address the question first, and then we can.
And then I will talk.
Just while it's fresh. So I don't know who wants to take that question from James. And yeah, James Lynch will be speaking in our last session, so make sure to stick around.
Lina, I think Lina, or Yahya can address this.
I think it's too difficult to understand the behavior for the regime and what they are planning to do. For example, when we first heard about the details about the murder for Jamal Khashoggi, it was difficult for us to believe it. Even people, they know Mohammed bin Salman is dictator, he can do lots of things, but what's happened, it's never expected. And also he did lots of things, it was not expected, like the war in Yemen, the issues and crises happen in the region with Qatar, with Iran, with Turkey, with Jordan, with Morocco, with everyone. So all of that's not expected. So he keeps surprising us with things suddenly without any pattern to understand where are we going. We used to have a dictator regime in Saudi Arabia. We used to have these violations, issues, crises outside the country. But it was, in the past, it was something we can know where is the patterns, we can understand the situation. After the murder for Jamal Khashoggi, lots of, let's say, officials or leaders around the world, they said he learned the lesson and he will stop and he will change and he will do reform. And when we ask where and when, they said the situation is a little bit calm, there is no new crisis. So they believe if there is nothing new and he kept the old crisis and the old issues, that's fair enough. This is what they believe. But the war in Yemen is still ongoing. The prison of conscience is still in the prison. And we recently have a huge loss when Dr. Abdullah Hamid passed away inside the prison. And people, maybe they don't know Abdullah Hamid. We call him the father for the reform in the country. He's one of the biggest, or maybe the biggest reformer in the country. Abdullah Hamid, since very long time, he was defending the human rights, the democracy, and asking for constitutional monarchy. They arrested him, they took him to the prison, they free him, he back again to his demand until they killed him inside the prison. And people, they don't dealt with this behavior like it is a real crime, because the regime, they said it was for his health, but nobody asked about what's happened to his health, because they sent him to the hospital in 1st of January last year. And the doctor, he said to him, you have a strike and you need to do operation as soon as possible. They took him back to the prison, not to the hospital. They throw him inside the cell until he passed away inside. Health condition. So I feel there is anything positively change, but maybe the only thing that's the regime is worried and little bit couldn't understand what's going on, because we have learned that Mohammed bin Salman is really surprised about when the media talked about him, or when the officials, they don't want to meet with him. And he said one time for people around him, he said that also for some journalists, another country like Russia always killing dissident. So he felt it is normal, and he felt because they don't like Saudi Arabia, they feel jealous from me and jealous from Saudi Arabia and from our money. And he couldn't understand what he did. And if he really understand why he have not stopped the war in Yemen, at least the war in Yemen. Yemen at this moment is the worst crisis in the world and still ongoing. And he don't want to solve the issue. Also, the prison of conscience, he have not released any of them. So I don't see any positive change. He's worried. Maybe it is difficult for him to go forward, but there is no guarantee. And we can't expect what he's going to do. Thank you.
I'm just going to comment. Just regarding this, I think it's important, when Hamad bin Salman came to power, he didn't have any legitimacy, whether it's an internal one or international one. And then, of course, with the Trump administration, they accepted it, etc. But then the thing is, Mohammed bin Salman does not care about his people. He doesn't care about Saudi people. All he cares about is to go to the throne and to be a king. And we see it because he imprisoned everyone. There's the academics are imprisoned, the activists are imprisoned, the economists are imprisoned. Even people who are not political in the first sense. So he doesn't like his people, and he doesn't even want to be to gain legitimacy inside of the country. All he cares about is about how the international community will see him. And so after the murder of Khashoggi, the only thing that really changed is that he felt that maybe internationally he won't be accepted anymore, and so he had to calm down a bit. Knowing that there's pressure from the international community. And then, at least I see it when I started advocating for Lujain, no one would hear me, no one would listen to me. I went to the European Parliament. It was, almost like they were saying it will be fine, and then after the murder of Khashoggi, that's when people started listening really, and, feeling that something wrong is going inside. And so we could see that we cannot reach MBS, we cannot reach the government, we cannot reach the decision makers. They don't care about our voices, they don't care about us. So we have to go through the people who have influence over him. And so we started seeing that the people who have influence over him started listening to us. So the problem now is that, people forget. And as Yahya said, it's their technique, and we see it also. Also with Lujain, when we didn't have any news, the media would stop talking about Lujain. So it was sometimes so difficult to keep, the pressure, because if she disappears, she's disappeared, and so what? What can they say? So to answer your question, I would say that, as you mentioned, internationally, regionally, it changed his behavior. And I would say, internally, it's not that it was a positive change, it was just a stagnation, so everything was stopped for a while because he didn't know really how to act. It's not like he released people, for his own image or anything. It was just a total silence, and we didn't even know how to reach to them. So I would say, this is like a kind of a stop in the Saudi history, MBS's violations history. And then, when people started forgetting, and then the allies also started rehabilitating him again, we see that everything is back. He sentenced activists, he killed a prisoner of conscience. And so we see that, he won't change. It all depends on how, the international community deals with him.
If I could add something, just while I was living in Saudi Arabia at the time of the murder, and I was conducting ethnographic research, which depended on surveys of Saudi citizens and interviews. And when that incident happened, I had been able to collect hundreds up until that point. After that incident, it completely shifted the dynamics on the ground. People were terrified. It was unexpected, so they didn't want to speak. They didn't feel safe to participate, and even I myself didn't feel safe or ethical like approaching people at that time. So I had to shift and kind of revisit how I was able to conduct research, just because that had completely changed everything. And then secondly, I think on the international scale, that's when the Saudi government really upped their lobbying game and their hiring of, firms to kind of improve their image.
Important to focus on human rights in the Gulf region. So stick around for that, and we'll see you very shortly. Thank you.
No, it's a test. I'm not.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Shall we start?
Good afternoon. Welcome to the second session of this conference on human rights in the Gulf. In this session, we're broadening out the focus to look at the Gulf countries more generally. We have a fantastic panel who are going to cover all of the region, all of the GCC countries plus Yemen. In the room, we have Khalid Ibrahim, who is the director of the Gulf Center for Human Rights. Perhaps I should introduce myself as well. I'm Melanie Ginjo, and I'm a barrister, and I've been on the advisory board of the Gulf Center for Human Rights for almost a decade now.
Yeah, 10 years.
Yeah. And we're online. On the live stream, we're also going to have Rothna Begum, who is the senior women's rights researcher at Human Rights Watch. We have Osama Al-Faki from Muwatana for Human Rights, who's going to focus on Yemen, and Devin Kenny, who's the Amnesty GCC researcher for Amnesty. And he's going to be concentrating on GCC countries apart from Saudi Arabia and Yemen. So between us all, we're going to be covering
The Gulf.
the whole region.
Yes.
So without much further ado, I think I'm going to move straight to you
Yeah.
because we have only an hour. So 10 minutes approximately from each of our speakers, and then we'll move to questions.
Yes.
So Khalid, if you'd like to go
Yes.
first. I think.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Melanie. I'm honored to be with Al-Quds for Human Rights. We and Al-Quds for Human Rights just in the same boat. We are putting all the efforts to defend people's rights in a region that marked with dictatorships for so long. We know about all the massive violations that happen in our countries on daily basis. And when we talk about the 6 countries that form the Gulf, we see trends. They are all almost treating human rights defenders worse than criminals. A criminal, when released, he could travel anywhere. But still, we have defenders across the Gulf region who are released, but they have no any right to talk to the media, to use social media networks, or to travel. And maybe I have to mention some names. In Saudi Arabia, Samar Badawi, Lujain al-Hadlul, Nasim al-Sadeh, Asam Koshik, and others. They are released. They are citizens, but they have no access to jobs, they have no access to media, and they are almost fully monitored. And that is really, I think that in the Gulf in 10 minutes. Maybe I will mention my colleague, Ahmed Mansour, who is in prison in United Arab Emirates. And for the first time, I will say that we have reliable information from the prison, from Al-Sadr prison, that confirm he was punished for the leaked letters that he sent to Human Rights Watch and Gulf Center for Human Rights. He was severely punished. He was moved to a small cell. He's still on solitary confinement. That is Ahmed Mansour in United Arab Emirates. Himself and all members of UAE, they are all really in the prison for their peaceful and legitimate human rights work. And I should mention the name of a prisoner of conscience, Muhammad Abdul Razak al-Sadiq, the father of our colleague who passed away in a tragic car accident, al-Sadiq. He's also still in prison. And the reality, anywhere in this world, finish your sentence to prisoners of conscience is still in prison, although they completed their full sentence. and the exclusive authorities, they need rehabilitation. And what kind of rehabilitation? They're moving them from a section in the prison to another section. In the very same prison, Al-Razini prison. That is UAE, trying their best to give an image of a civilized country. But always remember, behind all these palaces, there are people who are suffering. There are families who lost their loved one. So it is not easy. It is difficult when you talk about human rights in this country. And when we move to Bahrain, still, just as we speak, we have a campaign about calling for the freedom to the prisoners of conscience, including our colleagues Abdelhadi Al-Khawaja and the group of 13 activists who are still in prison just because they participated in the uprising that took place in 2011. In Bahrain, states, human rights work is if you want to work for rights, you will pay a heavy price. And if we move to Kuwait, we know that there are people in prison. The charity committee led by Habib Khanbari, not only arrested, but also ill-treated and tortured. And we know for sure that there are a lot of bloggers and other activists who were sentenced to heavy sentence due to their peaceful activities on the internet. If we move to Qatar, really Qatar, also we have some news from Qatar. On the 9th of August, 2021, it was the first big gathering in Qatar. It was a historical day in modern history of Qatar. People gathered in their rejection to the election legislations that were approved by the Emir of Qatar. And still there are, we published the names, there are 21 citizens who are still in prison due to their participation in the protests and due to their activities on the internet. I also have to mention the 5 citizens who are double banned, including the human rights defender and lawyer, Dr. Najib Al-Naimi. He's still in prison. Not to mention the recent election in which even not single woman in Qatar managed to get a seat in the Shura Council. And this is really something huge in a country that is going to host the World Cup. There's no even one single voice in the Shura Council. Move to Oman. Really, Oman, the work for human rights is only on the internet, and even that very sensitive to authorities, and in particular to the internal security service. I have colleagues who established the Omani group for human rights. It was just a group on the Facebook. The next day they were in prison. And this is the case all the time in Oman. If you publish a view or something on the internet, you will be targeted, you will be tortured. Then internal security service is there. And I have to appreciate the work that my colleague Nepal did in the past for Oman is doing for Saudi Arabia. We are all connected. We work for Saudi Arabia in the same force as we work for other Gulf countries. Now, if we move to the Gulf in general, take it as a region, really we see that the international community is still not doing enough. Believe me, we are lacking support. One of the main reasons why our colleagues are still in the prison is the unconditional support given by US and UK to oppressive governments in our region. And we know for sure, in front of Melina, we know the conditions that led to the release of Lujain. We know that little pressure will make a change, but ready as yet to make this change, to take this step, to put the pressure on our governments. And for that, a lot of our colleagues are still in prison. And then if we move to the civic space is totally closed across the Gulf. You have no right to establish, as I said, the human rights organization. Still, there are people who manage to set up human rights organizations. They are still in prison, like Mohammed al-Utaibi in Saudi Arabia and others. There are a lot of names, and there is no any chance to mention all the names. And if we go to torture is systematic in our countries, unfortunately. On the 4th of December, we released a new report about patterns of torture in Saudi Arabia. And the something that is so painful to us is the lack of accountability and the spread of this culture of impunity. We know about Dr. Musa Al-Qarani. He was killed in a prison. And we know that it was planned by Al-Mubahith to encourage other prisoners to attack him. And before that, Dr. Abdullah Al-Hamid, almost he was denied medical care, and he was really passed away due to that reason. And if we move to other prisoners who are suffering in prisons, we know for sure that even in prison, there is no any way that you could survive with all the pressure and with all the ill treatment across the region just because you are a prisoner of culture or you are a human right defender. So I go back to the point that we have this phenomena across the Gulf region, which is the lack of accountability and the spread of impunity. All torture survivors are really facing this dilemma, and we need really to work on it for us, for the Gulf Center for Human Rights. I finish with it. They managed to use the concept of an international jurisdiction, and we made some cases before the judiciary in France, a case in the UK. We are trying our best, and really we will be happy to make some cases for each single Gulf country. I stop here to give a chance for our colleagues who are online. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So now we're going to go to Rothna. Sheila. Great. Welcome to our panel, to our session. Would you like to speak now for approximately 10 minutes? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you to Al-Qust for inviting me today and for the distinguished panelists. I'm so happy to be here with so many of you and to be speaking about human rights in the Gulf on International Human Rights Day. Following after my colleague Khalid Ibrahim, who has very eloquently spoken about quite a range of issues that we're seeing across the Gulf region, I want to talk very specifically about Qatar, and particularly on women's rights in Qatar. Now, as many of you know, for the last 10 years, since the hosting of the World Cup, Qatar has been rightly focusing, human rights organizations have been rightly focusing mainly around migrant worker abuses in Qatar because they were bringing in millions of workers to help develop their infrastructure. And that has actually led to huge numbers of wage theft, violence, and even deaths of workers. But of course, as Khalid has also articulated, there's a lot of issues in Qatar, including around freedom of expression, association, and assembly, and in particular for women. So we at Human Rights Watch, you may know, have been working for a very long time in supporting Saudi women's right and their fight to end the male guardianship system there. Saudi Arabia has the most notorious male guardianship system in the region, and it lasts from women's birth until their death, and was intimately wrapped up with sex segregation in public life. Given how repressive it is for women, the changes taking place in recent years was after many years of battling by Saudi women's rights activism that has led to very small changes. But these new reforms from Saudi Arabia has actually meant that they're starting to become more in line with their Gulf neighbors who also discriminate against women. And what we saw happen, one of the most latest beginnings of the cracks into the male guardianship system, was a reform that took place in August 2019, which was after much activism by Saudi women and international outcry, when the Saudi authorities allowed women over the age of 21, like men, to be able to travel abroad without male guardian permission. At this time, we saw women in Qatar start becoming vocal about male guardianship rules in their life. Being inspired by Saudi women's rights activists, a few women started up a campaign account on Twitter listing some of the male guardianship rules, talking about that fact that they, as Qatari women who are unmarried and under the age of 25, are also required to have male guardian permission in the form of an exit permit to travel abroad. And yet, while Saudi Arabia was now making some changes, now Qatar was becoming somehow worse, with even higher restrictions than Saudi Arabia. We saw this as a time when, Qatari women coming to the fore trying to speak about this means that it was an important issue to really examine. What we also noticed was that account that they had tried to post on Twitter was shut down very, very quickly. The women behind it were summoned, and some of them were at risk of domestic violence for their activism. This year, in March 2021, we published a report entitled "Everything I Do is Tied to a Man." It's the first report to critically examine male guardianship rules in Qatar. Many women in Qatar don't actually know what all the rules are or whether there's a legal basis for these rules. And this report really aimed to unpack that reality in both law and practice. In August, so what we found was that women in Qatar must obtain male guardian permission to marry, study on government scholarships, work in many government jobs, travel abroad until certain ages, and receive some forms of reproductive health care. And a woman's male guardian may be her father, her brother, uncle, grandfather, or upon marriage, her husband. It has to be on the paternal side of the equation. This discriminatory system also denies women the authority to act as their children's primary guardian, even when they are divorced and have been awarded legal custody by a court. What we found is that male guardianship reinforces the power and control that men have over women's lives and their choices, and actually fosters and fuels domestic violence. Most of the women that we interviewed said that these rules had a heavy toll on their ability to lead independent lives. And some said that it affected their mental health, contributing to depression, stress, and suicide, or attempted suicide. Now, male guardianship rules actually contradict Qatar's own law, which sets the end of guardianship at the age of 18. And it also violates its own constitution and its obligations under international human rights law. Now, Qatar has no anti-discrimination law, and the lack of transparency over rules makes it really difficult for women to challenge them when they face discrimination. Now, Qatari women have become more vocal about their rights online, and yet they're facing government intimidation and online harassment when they do speak out. There are no independent women's rights organizations in the country to really hold the government to account for such discrimination. I'm just going to give a few examples about how this discrimination is occurring in relation to male guardianship. So when it comes to marriage, for instance, women need guardian permission at any age to marry, regardless of if they've been married before. And while men, on the other hand, can marry up to 4 women at any time, not only not needing male guardian permission, but they also don't need permission from their current or former wives. One 32-year-old Qatari woman said that her father had passed away and she wanted to get married, so she had to go to her younger brother for that permission. But she had a falling out with her younger brother just a while before. And she said he felt kind of powerful and he told her, "I'm not going to help you." We also documented how, women have no authority to make independent decisions relating to their own children, whether it's their documents, finances, or travel. And even where they have no male relative to act as a guardian, the government will take up this role rather than allow women to be able to do so. And what we found is that men can really abuse this position of power to harass women and to harm the children in question. So in the case of a woman who we're calling Qahtan, who's a 44-year-old Qatari woman and has 5 children, she said that her husband, in an act of revenge for divorcing him, prevented her and her children from traveling with her and also transferred her children from international schools to government schools. And in a court hearing this year, she said a judge rejected her petition to transfer her son to a different school on the basis that he could not interfere with the father's God-given right to decide where his child should go to school. And I do want to reflect that it is unusual that Qatar does this, because in other countries we've seen authorities start to give out some level of independent decision making to women who at least have custody of their children following a divorce. But Qatar really allows only male guardians to continue to have such level of authority over their children, even if they've passed away and even in the case of divorce. When it comes to studying, we found that women we'd interviewed told us that they were prohibited from studying abroad or attending mixed gender university spaces in Qatar, limiting what they could study and their future careers. The scholarships law, which is where we found, is that women indirectly needed male guardian permission in order to get government scholarships to pursue higher education. Most women actually end up going to Qatar University, which is the state's university, and it happens to be completely sex segregated. In that university, we found that women needed guardian permission to enter or leave the campus in a taxi, to live in student housing, and to take field trips as part of their studies. So really, even as very young women, they were finding themselves being treated as children. When it came to working, this is quite an unusual space where the labor law doesn't actually require women to have guardian permission to work, but the law didn't actually prohibit discrimination against women in the recruitment process itself. And what we found is that women told us that they needed guardian permission to work in many government jobs. Not all of them, but in most of them. When it comes to travel abroad, as I mentioned, the rules, not the law, Interior Ministry rules require unmarried Qatari women under the age of 25 to obtain guardian permission to travel abroad, and that women can also be subject to travel bans at any age by their husbands or fathers. And there's a real lack of transparency around these rules, which makes it really difficult for women to challenge them. So in 2020, after 2 Qatari women had fled the country and sought asylum in the UK, airport officials started to stop women traveling without a male relative and insisted on calling their male guardian to prove that they were not escaping. The authorities actually stopped both women under 25 who had valid permits and women who were over 25 who should not require such permission. And they each gave very different statements about why they were asking these women for such permission. When it comes to healthcare, women also need to show proof of marriage to access some sexual and reproductive healthcare, such as prenatal care, transvaginal ultrasounds, and sexual health checks. They also needed their husband's consent to obtain some forms of reproductive healthcare related to childbearing, such as sterilization and abortion. And sometimes this is even the case, even when there's nothing to do with, it's not actually about their sexual conduct. So one woman who was suffering from endometriosis, which is a disorder of a woman's reproductive system, has nothing to do with whether or not she's been sexually active. One woman told us that at the time she didn't know she had this, and she had gone to the hospital in complete pain. She was 18 at the time. The emergency doctor tried to refer to her for an ultrasound because he thought her ovaries had actually burst. And the next unit said that they couldn't give the ultrasound to her because she wasn't married. And so at that point, she had to lie and say, I am married, and called her male friend and asked him to lie and say that he was her husband so that they would perform the ultrasound on her. So even in cases of extreme pain and urgency of the care that's needed, the authorities are reluctant to do so unless they can prove that the woman is married. There are other discriminatory rules that we also documented, including how some hotels were prohibiting unmarried Qatari women under the age of 30 from renting a hotel room unless they were accompanied by a male relative. And Qatari women are also prohibited from attending some events or spaces that happen to be serving alcohol. So there are sometimes concerts and events where the ticketing system will actually say that Qatari women are prohibited from entering entirely. Now, while we're talking mostly about Qatari women, these rules are also affecting foreign national women who live in Qatar, who happen to be on visas of their husband or their father, who's actually their visa sponsor. And they're under very similar controls comparable to male guardianship. Women on such visas need their sponsor, which would be the husband or their father, their permission to get a driver's license, to work, or to obtain a government scholarship to study in the country as well. Now, we are calling on Qatar to remove all discriminatory rules against women, to really publicize these changes, pass anti-discrimination legislation, and ensure that women have the civic space to demand these rights. What we really found, and what was such a struggle, is that these rules can change at any time, that while some of these women are trying to be vocal about it, particularly on Twitter, they can face harassment, they can face intimidation, it can really impact their ability to study and to work. And because there are no independent women's rights organizations, they can't really take this fight to a much bigger level. While they've been really inspired by the Saudi women and their fights, it's been a real struggle for the Qatari women themselves to really bring this to the fore and to grant such changes. So I'll stop there, and I'm really looking forward to hear what the other panelists talk about as well. Thank you.
That was excellent. We're going to go now to Osama from Watana for Human Rights. You have approximately 10 minutes, if that's okay, to
Yes, thank you so
do
much.
your opening.
Thank you so much, and thanks to Al-Qist for Human Rights for giving me the space. I am Osama Al-Faqih, the Advocacy Director of Mawtana for Human Rights, and I'm based in Yemen, speaking to you from Sana'a. So by last September this year, the war in Yemen has completed its grim 7th year, which was started in September 2014 when Ansarullah Houthis took control of the capital Sana'a by force, and later escalated in March 2015 with the military intervention of the Saudi UAE-led coalition, internationally recognized government of Yemen. All warring parties in Yemen have committed widespread and systematic abuses and violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, and the criminal conduct of all parties to the conflict has claimed many thousands of civilian lives and caused the worst humanitarian crisis. Between January and November this year, Mawtana documented 11 incidents of Saudi UAE-led coalition airstrikes on civilians and civilian objects, killing and injuring dozens of civilians, and documented 47 incidents of ground attacks and killing and injuring civilians, including women and children, and the majority of these attacks were committed by Houthis. Arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, and torture are patterns of violations which Houthis, the internationally recognized government of Yemen, and also the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council are responsible for. The public space in the country has severely shrunk, and also the list of violations and abuses is long, including the attacks on hospitals, schools, child recruitment, and denial of humanitarian assistance. And civilians fought in different active front lines, particularly in Marib nowadays with the Houthi attack. In September, before the last UN Human Rights Council session, Mawtana and the Global Rights Compliance GRC released a report called Starvation Makers on the use of starvation as a method of warfare. Mawtana and GRC concluded that members of the Saudi UAE-led coalition and Houthis have used starvation as a method of warfare. The airstrikes in the case of the Saudi UAE-led coalition, and the restrictions on planting landmines in the case of Houthis, and their conduct severely impeded civilians' access to food and water. And they acted in spite of the widespread knowledge of the dire situation, humanitarian situation in Yemen, where people, including children, are dying from starvation. So far, the international community doesn't have the political will, failed to seriously intervene to stop the war in Yemen, and more importantly, failed to ensure accountability for all warring parties to the conflict. In October this year, as a result of the Saudi Arabia lobbying backed by the United Arab Emirates, UN Human Rights Council failed the Yemenis by disgracefully ending the mandate of the UN group of eminent experts, which was the first time in the history of the Council to terminate a mandate or a mechanism by the Council. This was the result of Saudi Arabia using incentives and threats against UN Human Rights Council member states to vote against the resolution. The UN group of eminent experts was the only international, independent, and impartial avenue to examine the human rights violations in Yemen, and was essential in supporting accountability efforts for millions of victims in Yemen. And finally, with the 7 years of bloody armed conflict, grave violations and abuses committed with impunity, what is required? It's required from the international community to consider accountability as one of the key elements to establish durable peace in Yemen. After the failure of the UN Human Rights Council last October, last week a coalition of more than 60 organizations called on the UN General Assembly to establish an independent and impartial body that would investigate and publicly report on the most serious violations and abuses of international law committed in Yemen, while also collecting and preserving evidence and preparing files for possible future criminal prosecution. At the end, I will highlight that in the armed conflict, there are no clean hands in Yemen, and the General Assembly member states should also create a new standing investigative mechanism to demonstrate to Yemenis that the United Nations will not turn a blind eye to their suffering. I will stop here, and thank you so much for giving me the space.
Thank you so much. Next, we're going to go to Devin Kenny. Hello, welcome to our panel.
Yes, can you hear me?
Could you speak for approximately 10 minutes?
Yes, and just to confirm, you're hearing me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. So thanks to Melanie for moderating, and thanks to Khalid and Rosna and Osama for your enlightening but disturbing overview of the situation of human rights in the Arabian Peninsula. So I am going to just very quickly review some significant human rights developments in Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, and the UAE this year, those being the 4 countries that I cover for Amnesty International. And we'll just take them alphabetically, starting with Bahrain. Bahrain remains frozen in the state of repression that it's been in for at least the past 5 years. And while the government does seek to project some image of change, any change that may appear on the surface is that it's surface and superficial. So let's take, for example, the Ombudsman of the Ministry of Interior, which is the main point of public interface for Bahraini citizens who have a human rights grievance to raise with their government. In April, while there was a COVID outbreak spreading in Jau Central Prison in Bahrain, Amnesty International was in touch with the family of a prisoner named Fadil Abbas al-Jaziri, who described how their interaction with the Ombudsman's office went. They had gone there to register a complaint, being concerned about Fadil's well-being during the outbreak. So when they went to the office, the person receiving them and supposedly recording their complaint at the desk refused to give them any paper report recording what the information they had relayed to him or her, refused to give the family a receipt showing that they had submitted a report, and refused even to give a case number so that they might seek to track any progress made on investigating the cases they went forward. And when a family member attempted to take a photograph of what the ombudsman employee was writing using a phone camera, they were told by employees in the office that they were not allowed to do that, and basically ushered out. So it was the equivalent of throwing their complaint into a black hole. It was absolutely unserious as an effort at accountability. In another example of this sort of phenomenon of merely superficial change, the Bahraini government this year has projected a lot of news about how it's now implementing its alternative sentencing law. So let's take the case of one individual who was released under this law, Kumail Jum'a. Kumail's original case that brought him into prison was absurd. He was handed 29 years in prison for alleged acts of so-called terrorism that he committed between, or is said to have committed between the ages of 13 and 17. So the state's position is that this kid was a terrorist mastermind starting from the age of 13. So the original case was non-credible on its face and severely marred by unfair trial procedures. He was, after some international attention, fortunately released under the alternative sentencing law this September, but under what conditions? He cannot attend any political, religious, or cultural gathering, and that is a direct quote from the release documents, which I was able to look at. And he cannot speak to the media, and he cannot write on social media. So the condition of his release is basically stripping him of the right to freedom of expression. And more recently, the family of Kumail has updated us and told us that he's being subjected to petty harassment by the state when he has school hours, when he should be in school completing his secondary school education. He will get summoned, left and right from week to week by state security authorities saying you need to be present at a so-called rehabilitative lecture, which is in a completely different part of the country. So when he goes to the so-called rehabilitative lecture, it's a joke. They tell him things like, you can't wear black t-shirts, you can't wear sandals. The most recent time he was called to interrupt his studies to go do this, there was just no one there. There were no officials to receive him to implement his so-called rehabilitation. So it's harassment, which is intended to disrupt his right to education. And so, this is accomplishing the original goal of Bahrain's repression. Freedom of speech is quashed and the target is made to suffer and not actually rehabilitated. So again, superficial change, lacking proper substance and improving human rights. Kuwait. In Kuwait, the central government this year has continued to act in its traditional pattern, which is a sort of balancing act of repression. Kuwait will often use threats of imprisonment rather than actual imprisonment in order to control the population. So to give an example, in June this year, a Kuwaiti national named Jamal Sayar was detained and prosecuted because he had written criticism of the emir online. Now, he was acquitted eventually in November, but he still spent over a week in jail and 6 months undergoing prosecution and being under the threat of being sent to prison. Most people will not say something if it brings with it a high likelihood that they will go to prison. So Kuwait is able, often without resorting to the actual expedient of putting people in prison, which comes with reputation costs, they're still able to very effectively suppress the right to freedom of expression. And in a second instance of this sort of pattern, one step forward, one step back, or a balanced model of repression. This past month, the emir pardoned or commuted the majority of the defendants and prisoners from a previous case of unfair trial, the Al-Abdali case, which originates in 2015. It was a quite sectarian case. Those charged were all Shia Kuwaitis, and they were accused of supporting the interests of Iran and the Lebanese Shia group Hezbollah against the interests of the Kuwaiti state. Totally unfair trial and credible allegations of very nasty torture. So this November, last month, the emir did release a large number of people from that trial by pardon and commutation, but at the same time, the state launched a new case, which is incredibly similar to the Al-Abdali case. During the first wave of this new case, Khalid, this is the same case Khalid referred to that involves the Sheikh Habib Ghadantari. He was one of those detained in the first wave in which 8 Kuwaiti nationals were detained without any due process. All of the Kuwaiti nationals detained are congregates at or clerics at the Al Hussein Mosque, which is one of the major Shia mosques in the country. And they're all being accused, as with Al-Abdali, of support for Hezbollah. Not formally charged, but accused. They were held for several days by state security without being able to see their lawyers and were subjected to sleep deprivation and likely worse during interrogation. So that's Kuwait. Oman. An overall note about Oman is people are extremely scared to speak in Oman. It's the same level of fear that I encounter in the UAE and Oman. And I think sometimes people may make a false assumption about Oman as a country, that because not a great amount of news comes out of it, the situation there is not troublesome or problematic. I would say, quite the opposite in my experience speaking with Omanis. There's silence often from the country due to fear, and this should make us extremely skeptical about conditions in the country. What does get out isn't encouraging. So this year, Amnesty monitored a series of detentions and prosecutions with people speaking and protesting in Oman. In February, there were 4 individuals. Their names were Ahmed Qatan, Salim al-Ma'ashani, Amr Beit Saeed, and Salim Tabouk, who were detained for commenting on Twitter on government development plans, and all were brought to prosecution. In July, there was an Omani national named Qaith al-Shabli, and him and at least 2 others were detained for speaking about atheism on Twitter. In August, there was a fellow named Khamis al-Hatali, who was detained for calling the Sultan an oppressor online. As in Kuwait, not every single one of these cases, or in fact most of these cases, did not result in prison sentences, but they did result in people being detained, questioned, spending days in jail, in some cases receiving a financial punishment, and in some cases receiving suspended prison sentences, which means the threat of prison hangs over your head if you speak out again. So again, it's a repressive mechanism that is very effective in quashing speech. And lastly, the UAE. There's a lot to say about the UAE, which is a very repressive and frightening government. But I'm just going to talk about one case that I think didn't get enough attention this year. This summer in Abu Dhabi, security forces in the middle of the night carried out a mass detention followed by deportation of hundreds of legal residents who were clearly targeted because they were Black Africans. What this looked like was, in the middle of the night, huge numbers of security forces burst into residential buildings, moved through kicking down doors and picking out the residents who were Black. They then transported them to Al Wathba prison, where they were held for weeks or months on end with no due process whatsoever, in conditions that were atrocious. We're talking about like 140 people or more held in a single space with 4 toilets. And then they were all deported back to their countries of origins with no court date, with nothing, despite the fact that they were legally present in the country with visas. And they were deported back stripped of everything. They returned home. Me and my colleague interviewed 18 of these victims. They were returned home at airports with no cash. They had lost all their savings because it was in Emirati bank accounts, which they couldn't access. They had lost national identity cards, birth certificates, marriage certificates, school diplomas, university degrees, professional licenses, medical records, all things that they had kept with them in their home, which they had made in the UAE, and which were not returned to them. That happened in the heart of Abu Dhabi, in the residential district right next to the island with the Louvre, New York University, the Guggenheim, all these high-cost purchased cultural attractions. It's an area where many, many very wealthy expats live. So to me, this story is just indicative of how scary a place the UAE is, and how it's a government that feels that it has very few restraints on what it can and will do. So I'll end my remarks there, but I believe we'll have some questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We now have about 10 minutes for questions. Anybody from the floor?
Questions?
If there is no question, I could add something important, really, because I forgot to talk about it. Okay. Well, I call from here on the government of Qatar to declare. I call from here. This is the International Human Rights Day, and I call on the government of Qatar to publicly declare the fate of women human rights defenders Nawfal Ma'adid. We just recently received troubled reports about her fate. We are not going to publish these reports until we hear from the government of Qatar. She left UK on the 30th of September after she got insurances from the Minister of Interior that she will be protected. On the 13th of October, she disappeared from her hotel. We know what happened to her. We have reports, but we are not going to publish these reports until we hear from the government of Qatar. She's a citizen. She got promise from the Minister of Interior that she will be protected, but that never happened. So we are waiting the government of Qatar. And there's something else that we didn't mention because of the limited time is the digital attacks on the vendors, the Pegasus project, and the fact that it is not just NSO. We took a judicial case in France against NSO based on the concept, using the concept of international jurisdiction, but this is not enough because we have now information that many other companies opened offices in UAE, and really based on the security treaties and the cooperation between the 6 Gulf states, all of us at risk. We have only the world. We have only the peaceful and legitimate human rights work, but they have millions to spend on importing the most sophisticated surveillance equipment. My colleague Ahmed Mansour, he was the first victim of Pegasus project, and we all at risk. And there should be something to be done about it, and the international community has to defend those people who are working for human rights against these attacks, digital attacks. So I'll stop here to see if there are questions.
Thank you very much, Jawad Firuz Salam DHR. I think it's good that we can raise all these human rights violations in all GCC countries and bring up all the individual cases. And I think we're going to continue in that way. But I think somehow we have shifted our attention as a policy toward the core issues in a way that without having an independent judiciary, without having an independent observatory role within a body in the country, without enhancing the meaning of the accountability, without, let me say, having separation of power, without power share, I think such stories, such human rights violation will continue, I think, for ages coming. So I think somehow we as human rights defenders and even NGOs, they have to now start to shifting their more attention to the core issue of that one, demanding all these independence bodies that shouldn't be under the rule of the ruling country. I mean, a ruling family, for example, or somehow the people should have such power to go ahead and do the accountability without gaining all these changes within these countries. I think it is very, very hard. For sure, any local legislation should be shifted toward where our international conventions is being said toward the human rights issue and so on. So without this core issue, I think we're going to hear such really, really grave stories years and years. Thank you.
Hello, this is Matthew, and I was having a question for Osama. Is there an update on the Belhaf prison in Shabwa, given the current hostilities and its position as a base for the SDC to disappear persons? Total, I believe, were working there alongside the UAE within this establishment, but has there been any update on its conditions? Sorry.
Yeah, honestly, I don't have an update at the moment with me, but yes, as you mentioned, this facility has been used by the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council forces, and it was used for forcibly disappearing persons and torturing people.
Do we have one more question? We have time for one more, maybe.
Yeah.
My question is for Ratna. Thank you so much for your presentation. I had a question. So it seems like it's you managed to interview people in Qatar. Do you feel like it's as difficult as in Saudi Arabia, or now Saudi Arabia is less accessible?
Yes, that is for Ratna.
Thank you.
Ratna, did you hear that?
Yeah, sure. I
Saudi
can
Arabia
go
and
ahead and
Qatar.
respond.
Oh,
Yeah.
she has.
Great. Thanks so much, Lena. Great to see you in the event itself. So I spoke to over 50 women in depth interviews and over 73 interviews overall. Initially, it was, we've done the reports in Saudi Arabia before, and actually it was easier to speak to Saudi women than it was to speak to Qatari women, because with the Qatari society, they're just not used to speaking to human rights organizations. So it's a fairly new thing for them anyway. And it's a very restrictive environment. So a lot of them were very scared about the idea of speaking about their country. It's an atmosphere of you have to protect the nation's image. And so anyone talking out about it was a real problem. So I used encrypted applications on the phone, and actually doing over the phone was a bit easier because meeting them in person in country might actually be more difficult for them to do so. In terms of comparison of which one is worse right now, Qatar is still an open country, so technically I can go to the country, even if finding women to speak to might be a bit difficult. But Saudi Arabia isn't, right? And so that's always been a problem, but it's even more of a problem now than it has been in the past, where now there are women that we might have been able to speak to in Saudi who might not be able to speak to us without fearing a lot worse, right? And a lot of the women's rights activists who would have been the ones connecting and speaking in academic conferences and so on, were not really in a space to do so. So in a sense, while we're seeing a few reforms in Saudi, what the big issue in Saudi is that these trickle reforms will really grind to a halt, right? As soon as the world is not looking that way, or they're not headline grabbing reforms, they're not going to make the reforms we want them to. So they're not really making massive reforms in Saudi Arabia anyway. And the other issue is sometimes, as you probably know, Lena, they tend to regurgitate old things, right? So they claim that women can get bank accounts. Well, they could always get bank accounts. So they sometimes make up reforms in Saudi Arabia just because they want to keep getting credit for so-called women's rights reforms. In Qatar, it's really interesting in the sense that they are not choosing a proper PR strategy on women's rights, unlike Saudi Arabia. And it's a space in which they, in fact, go out of their way to seem conservative on it, particularly for their society, because it's an issue in which there's been a sort of, what we've seen over the years is when they do provide some level of reform, it's always been, okay, we will allow women to drive, which Saudi Arabia has done only very recently. But Qatar did this a while ago. But when they did it, they allowed women to drive, but with male guardian permission. So every time they give a bit of a reform or space for women, they always make sure that the family or the male guardian is the one that gets to decide. So it's very similar to Saudi Arabia. And the one thing I would take, at least in terms of good things, is that everything that the Saudi women have been doing, that Lujain has been doing, has really sparked a lot of the Qatari women, particularly the younger women, to really come to the fore and to fight for these changes. They've been completely inspired by seeing what's happening in Saudi Arabia and what the Saudi women have had to go through to get to where they are, and are starting to start thinking about how they can do it themselves. It's not easy, and it's a much harder battle because they're much further behind than a lot of the Saudi women were, because the Saudi women have been doing this. There's a lot more of you, and you've been doing this for a long time. But with Qatari women, it's a lot more nascent in stages. But the hope is, you've really inspired something here, and I really do hope that we're going to start to see similar changes in Qatar as well.
Thank you so much. So we're going to round this session. I'm afraid we've run out of time now.
Quickly, we have no minute.
What do you think?
Let's hear the question, because
okay.
when
Thanks. You gave me enough time to get my act together. I just wonder if any of the researchers or speakers have looked into the UK government's Gulf Strategy Fund. It's a multi-million-dollar fund that was only sort of, the government gave some description of it in February after several years of it running. It's unclear whether the programs that are being funded have human rights assessments that are done alongside them. And I just wondered if it's a fund that troubles you, if you've looked into it, you've engaged with any policymakers on it. Thanks.
We are not going to get money from UK government, a government that is supporting oppressive governments in our region. We are not going to operate in terms of finance. That is impossible, really, to apply for such a fund. UK government first has to support human rights, to show visibility to human rights defenders, and then we think about getting support in terms of finance. And I leave my colleague, maybe they have other comments.
Anybody else want to comment on that question?
I mean, if you look at the Gulf Strategy Fund, it's quite clear that there are not very clear human rights indicators as part of that fund. What we saw in the last few years, particularly following Brexit, is that the UK government is invested in increasing trade with the Gulf governments. In Saudi Arabia, for instance, the desk office setup was increased by threefold. None of whom were interested in human rights in Saudi Arabia. So we're really seeing a move away from talking about human rights, even if that was always limited, to much more about talking about things in which it would benefit the UK economically speaking, rather than ensuring that these are countries and these are governments that are rights respecting.
Thank you. Would either of the other two panelists like to comment?
Yeah, time is over.
Okay, we're going to bring it to a close now. Thank you so much, all of you, for such comprehensive and detailed comments about the Gulf region and the situation now. I think we have 15 minutes for coffee before the next session. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Want to tell them to sit down? So welcome everybody to today's third session on strategies of securing accountability for human rights abuses in the Gulf region. Joining me here in London is Matthew Hedges, British academic, and James Lynch, the founding director of Fair Square. And online, I think there is Ramzi Qais, the legal fellow of MENA Rights Group, and Marwa Fatafta, the MENA policy manager of Access Now. So after having spoken, I think, at large about the abuses taking place all throughout the Gulf region, I think it's time now to think about strategies of how we can hold the governments to account for these violations. And we'll be addressing that both sort of from an individual perspective and also from an NGO perspective. I'm Julia Ligner. I'm the head of advocacy at Al-Qist for Human Rights. We're focusing mainly on Saudi, but now with the Ala Sadiq unit, also on other Gulf countries. I think it's our experience, at least for Saudi, to say that international pressure is really what has worked in the past. Since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the international community has become more outspoken on Saudi Arabia. We have seen joint UN statements at the Human Rights Council that have had a great impact on the release of some of the women human rights defenders, and increased political actions such as resolutions by the European Parliament that have also led to concessions. But it will be very interesting to hear from our guests what they believe will help to hold the governments accountable. And therefore, I would like to start with Matthew Hedges, who, as I said, is a British academic and security expert. He has been arbitrarily detained in the United Arab Emirates in 2018 and was accused of being a British spy. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but was later pardoned and released. He is now suing UAE officials for the ill treatment and torture he was subjected to during detention. He's the plaintiff in a pending lawsuit in France, as well as a civil lawsuit in the United Kingdom. So it would be great to hear from you, Matthew, about the legal routes you're trying to hold UAE officials to account for their abuses against you.
Thank you very much for coming and attending this afternoon and for staying here and keeping your attention. So as Julia said, so far we have filed a civil case here in the UK against the UAE government, and we have 4 criminal cases filed in Norway, Sweden, France, and Turkey against the UAE. There's at least 4 senior ranking officials in this case. These are, as Julia said, these are based on universal jurisdiction and torture. In the UK, this has gone through the High Court and it's been filed against the UAE. Whereas elsewhere, under universal jurisdiction, the authorities are continuing to examine the scope and also keep the files open. So when the accused do enter the country, then these processes can start legally and they can be questioned. Maybe the most high profile figure we have a case against is now the president of Interpol, Major General Ahmed Nasser Raisi. So filing a case in France would mean that potentially the president of Interpol can be picked up and he can be arrested and maybe even sentenced for human rights abuses. It's been critical and it's crucial to be able to make a stand and come with solid evidence at that international level, so that it's not a polemic argument. It's a way to stand up and to illustrate how these abuses aren't taken lightly. And I know, coming from position of privilege, realistically, that I'm lucky to be here and many other people aren't. I think that's what has given myself, my barrister Rodney Dixon, and the other plaintiff Ali Is Ahmed kind of fuel and encouragement to be able to take this forward. I understand that this is a very difficult and stressful practice for people and individuals to take. If they've been through abuses, all they want to do is maybe shut the door and kind of walk away. But realistically, even if they did, it doesn't mean that their own trauma, those emotional scars, those psychological scars would heal. It's a way, actually, it's cathartic. It's a way to help heal. But when you're coming up against states such as the UAE or Saudi Arabia or other Gulf states who have significant financial capabilities and a hybrid ability to manipulate and to continue harassing you, transnationally, it can also become quite a dangerous endeavor to continue. What I would maybe say is the more vocal you are, the more protection you actually give yourself. And this is something that has happened to us personally. We've had continued harassment here in the UK, and threats to individual safety and security. And as a UK national here is one thing, but if you are a citizen or a national of another country, your rights and your independence and integrity is really in danger. So the only thing I would advocate and support is continue to go down that line, because that's what keeps you in that front and center, really. And that's the only reason that might be able to deter some of these states from committing some of the acts that they may want to in the future. The reputational risk has been seen so far against Saudi Arabia and the UAE, at least in Europe and the West. It may not be sea change, but examples such as the delayed purchase of Newcastle United and how this had to be discussed at a very public level, it shone a bright light upon their activities. The UAE wanted to invest 400 million into Cambridge University, but the university had to reject this after the systemic human rights abuses, which they claim were highlighted from Pegasus, let alone other examples. And if we can at least continue to show that these experiences and these episodes aren't isolated incidents, but they are part of a systemic system of abuse, their reputational risk will take a hammering, and this is what ultimately is going to cost them. So I know it's tough. I know it's hard to do, but people need that support, and when necessary, coming together in a meeting like this, it's very it's crucial to not be polemic, but to have that evidence-based approach, and where possible, go through those legal channels, so it enters an arena which can be disputed, but publicly. They always want to hide things, but by shining that light upon these activities, you bring the conversation into an environment which they don't like. And yes, that's what I'm going to say today, but thank you very much for attending.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for sharing information on the legal routes you're pursuing, and that you're doing that also not just to seek justice in your own case, but to really make the international community aware of the violations happening and to potentially prevent similar violations in the future. And I think you've mentioned sports washing here quickly. I hope we can come back to this a little later, because we want to discuss political accountability, legal accountability, but then there's also, those attempts to whitewash the image and what role could businesses play in that, or entertainers, sports clubs, and so on. So next I would like to move to Marwa Fatafta, who is joining us online. As I mentioned, Marwa is the MENA Policy Manager of Access Now. And I think it's been mentioned in previous sessions, the large problem of surveillance all throughout the Gulf region. And as Marwa is specializing in digital rights and surveillance, I was hoping she will share with us a little bit about lawsuits that are pending on or against certain firms such as the NSO Group, and also how to really hold accountable those technology firms for the human rights abuses they're involved in, or if she might even want to take it to a political dimension of better export control for surveillance technology. So Marwa, if you're with us, I would pass it on to you.
Thank you very much, Julia, and hi, everyone. I hope you can see me and hear me clearly. It's really a pleasure for me to join this conference and to join this particular discussion, especially that we are at a very critical and interesting time. As probably many of you know, the last few weeks or actually months have been pretty much interesting in terms of shedding the light on surveillance technologies and spyware firms, and namely the NSO Group, which has been making headlines for the past few months for the use of its Pegasus spyware to hack the devices of human rights defenders and activists around the world, and especially from the MENA region. As recognized, these digital mercenaries or spyware firms have enabled authoritarian regimes like the Saudi regime or the UAE to expand their repression beyond their jurisdictions and geographical borders, evident, of course, by the multiple cases of hacking devices of activists based in the UK, Canada, and elsewhere, including some of members of Al-Qasd organization. And I think there's definitely a role for us as civil society organizations to play in holding these companies accountable. We're talking about an extremely powerful yet opaque industry. We don't know who are the main players. We don't know how many surveillance companies there are in the world. We know, though, that they provide basically spies for hire for any government that has the money to purchase these expensive malicious spyware tools, like the Saudi regime, like the UAE, are happy to provide that to be able to obtain these very powerful cyber weapons. And because they are not regulated, it's been running pretty much wild, providing whoever wants to have access to these dangerous tools. And I think litigation is very important here. We know that there are currently actually two lawsuits in the US by big tech, namely by WhatsApp, and very recently by Apple against NSO Group for exploiting their software to hack the devices of human rights defenders, activists, and lawyers, among others. We, as Access Now, we've filed an amicus brief in the WhatsApp lawsuit, which, just a bit of a briefing about the lawsuit. I believe in 2019, NSO Group used a vulnerability in WhatsApp and hacked the devices of around 1,400 individuals, including activists from our region. The NSO Group tried to derail the lawsuit by claiming foreign immunity, but very recently, a few weeks ago, the US Appeal Court rejected that claim, and now they're proceeding potentially for discovery, which is really major. And I think it's really important because not only it allows the chance for victims of surveillance whose privacy and dignity has been violated by the use of the spyware, and it's important for them to seek redress and justice, but it's also a step towards accountability and transparency. And so the next lawsuit that was filed also very recently by Apple, same story against NSO Group for exploiting iOS running software or running program to hack all of the devices with civil society and media investigative work have been covering for the past few years, pretty much I think since 2016, when Citizen Lab investigated the hacking of Ahmad Mansour, the Emirati human rights defender who's still serving a 10-year sentence and is held in solitary confinement. And I think here it's important to as part of accountability, and when we talk about accountability strategies, in addition to litigation by big tech, but also by individual cases. I know, for instance, we work very closely with Reporters Without Borders, with the Gulf Center for Human Rights, and on the heels of the Pegasus Project revelations, which broke in July this year, there's been a number of lawsuits filed by civil society organizations and by these two groups in France on behalf of victims of surveillance. And I think this is a very important and key step. But second step is public advocacy and campaigning. When I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that this is an interesting political climate for us to hold these companies accountable, I think, with the Apple lawsuit, with the U.S. court appeal court rejection of NSO's attempt to derail the lawsuit, and most importantly, the U.S. blacklisting of NSO Group and another Israeli surveillance company called Kangaroo. These are three major steps towards accountability, and it makes it really hard for these companies to continue to profit off human rights violations with full impunity. And I don't think it would have been possible for us to reach this point without the continuous work from civil society organizations, including Citizen Lab, Amnesty Tech, Forbidden Stories, and many others who shed light on these different stories of surveillance and show us to what extent actually surveillance technologies have proliferated and enabled authoritarian regimes to extend and practice their repression at home and abroad. To use the cliche phrase, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I think to fight surveillance, transparency is extremely important. And without showing how, the danger, the extent of where these surveillance technologies and surveillance companies are running without any accountability or transparency, and the fact that now is the time to hold them not only accountable, but to actually regulate this industry, because it proved that it cannot regulate itself. As long as there are no policies, as long as there are no laws nationally or globally that trying in surveillance tech and the surveillance industry, these companies will continue to profit business as usual. And I think the NSO Group, we keep mentioning it not only because it has provided all these different regimes. I think only yesterday another story broke about the use of Pegasus in Kazakhstan, but also because it's kind of the poster child of the surveillance industry, whereby they are repeating the claim that their technologies are used to prosecute or to actually help governments fight terrorism and crime. And despite of NSO's implications in one of the most brutal murders that happened in our time, the murder of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And even though the NSO Group has been implicated through spying on his closest circle of activists, family and friends, they still, until today, export these technologies to the same regimes and to others, basically whoever has cash to pay for these kind of technologies. And even though they tried to have a so-called human rights policy right after the murder of Khashoggi, we can see that these are all just window dressing attempts for them to continue their business, again, without a shred of accountability, and therefore they cannot be trusted. And we need to press charges, whether in personal or an individual capacity, or as we've seen in the two lawsuits by Apple and WhatsApp. But also, as I said, public campaigns and advocacy is important to highlight these stories, to also highlight the violence that is inflicted on individuals who have been targeted, and the violence inflicted on their communities. When you are surveilled, it's not only a violation of your privacy and your dignity, but it also endangers your contact and it endangers the communities you work with, especially when we talk about a context like Saudi Arabia, where those who live in exile and work on human rights have to have a secure connection to their sources and the activists who work on the ground. And if someone is being targeted, it could lead to the arrest of people who they work with in Saudi Arabia, but also elsewhere. And lastly, with the current political environment or climate, so to speak, I think it's also time to explore the option of sanctions. And we recently joined a call by Human Rights Watch and other human rights organizations calling on the European Union and also foreign ministers of European member states to list NSO Group under its global human rights sanctions regime. And similarly, I think the US blacklisting of NSO is extremely important, but of course it's still narrow in scope. But again, it sends the powerful message that now is time for accountability. And so looking at, levying targeted sanctions on these companies, those who operate them and actually continue to cash in and profit from these human rights abuses, it needs to really come to an end through the use of these different mechanisms. So to wrap up, I would, or to summarize, I would say litigation, advocacy, and sanctions. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marwa, for your remarks and the information on different paths to pursue accountability, specifically for violations of the online persecution of human rights activists. I would now like to pass on to James Lynch, who's the founding director of Fair Square, a newly found human rights NGO, doing a lot of research on migrants' rights and corporate responsibility, also business and human rights. He's also the visiting fellow at the European Council for Foreign Relations. And I believe James will tell us a little bit more about political accountability in Europe, but potentially also globally. So please go ahead.
Thanks very much. And thanks to Matthew and Marwa for their fascinating words as well. Yeah, I was going to talk a little bit about, we've obviously heard about the challenges and the difficulties of securing legal accountability in the Gulf region for human rights violations. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what it might take to secure some kind of political accountability. And by that, I guess I mean here the idea that states in the region, governments in the region might face some kind of consequences in their bilateral relationships as a result of linked to their human rights performance and the human rights violations that they commit. And this piece of work I did for the European Council on Foreign Relations, I looked at this across the Middle East and North Africa, looking at European foreign policy and how it deals with the issue of human rights. And I think the first thing I wanted to sort of highlight was that, look, in that study, I really came across this major discrepancy between European governments' what they say at a global level and what they do at a regional level. Because at the global level, it is very clear and very loud that Europeans, and I include, by the way, the UK here in that definition, are very concerned about the global trend towards authoritarianism, the retreat of democracy, as we see in the scores that the Economist Intelligence Unit gives every year. Democracy is in retreat. The damage that is being suffered every year to international frameworks around human rights, And we can see that although, some of this, looking just at what, for example, Macron and Merkel say in public, their language is very strong on this, and they put it actually as quite a high priority when they speak publicly. Merkel said a year or two ago, this was, possibly the greatest challenge the world faces. And some of that, clearly we see Biden's Summit for Democracy as part of the same concern, that democracy is under threat, and including, of course, in Europe and in the US, which have traditionally been the countries that promote democratic rights, democratic values. And we see that this is taking some effect institutionally. I think the UK is an interesting example here. The integrated review, the sort of security review that happened earlier this year, that was published earlier this year, has a big focus on open societies. And that's translated into quite a formation of quite a big open societies department at the Foreign Office, which appears to have, as I understand, more authority than the old Human Rights Department did. So there's something going on there. But when we look at this in the Middle East and specifically in the Gulf, we see a big discrepancy. This is, I think, as described to me by a lot of people I spoke to for this study, Europeans are kind of missing in action. They're very muted, and that's in contrast to some other regions of the world. Amnesty did a study, which I'm sure many of you will be aware of, where they looked at the EU's support for human rights defenders in Saudi Arabia versus those in China, and they found a really significant difference. So Europe is prepared to speak robustly in support of human rights defenders in some areas of the world and not others. What the Middle East, is particularly sensitive. It seems, because of the commercial and security interests. I think it's also something that came through very strongly is the perceived sense of competition that there is now more competition for influence and leverage in the region. That Europeans are in relative decline. Obviously, this is kind of part of a picture that we all have of the US somehow in retreat. And there's also a sense that comes through, and I spoke to a lot of diplomats from this, of, a sense of kind of depression following the kind of defeated hopes after 2011. And a kind of retreat to a kind of let's go for resilience. We want partnership with governments to provide security and control migration. These are the kind of main priorities that we see in the region now. I think when I talk to diplomats about this and they say, we don't think we've got the leverage, we don't think it's worth us putting ourselves out there on human rights because we don't have the faith that we can have a positive impact, and then we will detonate our bilateral relationships, and then we can't secure our interests. And I think it's really interesting to take on this issue of do Europeans, do the Americans have leverage? And I think probably most people in this room would say, and certainly when I looked at this, there are lots of examples of when there is coordinated action and when there is a threat of some form of consequences, that they do have leverage. And there are many, many individual cases that I guess we can all point to that show that the way. So I think, I guess one of the things I've been looking at is how do we drive a bit more concerted effort? How can we motivate governments that are, in a sense, part of the problem to take more of an interest in this issue and to be more concerted in what they do here? And I think I come to the conclusion that one of the things we need to be maybe better at making the link here to national interest, to the fact that actually, if governments are not promoting more seriously these international norms around human rights and also democracy, that they have to look at the risk that will create for themselves. And I think that's I think maybe what's interesting about the Biden summit, and however much we can, I'm sure we all have sort of our views on how effective that's going to be, and there's a lot of skepticism about it. But I think that does show that there is a linkage now to what happens in places like the Gulf to what also happens in Europe and in the US, because democracy is a threat everywhere. And I think it's really important to look at what's the narrative that's being created around, what is the narrative that we see emanating from the Gulf? Because Saudi Arabia and the UAE are two examples I will take here, are not just authoritarian within their own borders. They are actively exporting a model of, and I put this in quotes, sort of effective autocracy. there is a sort of narrative around the effectiveness of authoritarianism, and we referred to it. I think it was Yahya and possibly Lina, the concept of the strong leader who can deliver public services, can eliminate corruption, but the price for that to be paid is the sealing up of the public sphere. And I think what we see is a narrative where that is contrasted with, for example, Lebanon or Tunisia, where corrosive corruption and a kind of lack of strong leadership mean that people cannot make a better life for themselves in those contexts. And that begins to be quite a powerful narrative taking hold. And I think what's interesting to me is that I think we see clear examples of where, in Europe, people like that. People actually quite like that idea. And I've seen, for example, British politicians coming back from the Gulf and saying, look what's been achieved. Look at this economic and development miracle. Look at the speed at which these cities are going up. And I think, I've spent 10 years working on migrant labor rights. I think most of us in this room know how this economic miracle is being achieved. And, as Rothner referred to earlier, the lives and livelihoods that often go into those programs. And I turn here to, if we're looking at examples of where the risks come at home, Julia referenced the issue of sport. I think if we look in this country at Manchester and Newcastle, this is another example of where civil space in Europe is actually being captured by authoritarians. In Manchester, I think everybody's very well aware of the way that fans have been captured and now actively, not just that they acquiesce with the sense that they have that Abu Dhabi, is the owner of the club and the supporter of the club, but they actively seek to support the policies of the government, to accuse human rights defenders of being terrorists, and to promote the policies, the foreign policies and the domestic policies of the UAE government. And we see the local politicians and local newspapers effectively acquiescing in that for a whole variety of incentives. Of course, one of which is emotional, the emotional power of there may be, financial incentives as well, for cash-strapped cities looking for development funds. And Newcastle, I think that the model that has been worked in Manchester is happening in Newcastle. And I think one of the things that was really striking was the fact that, the local council and local MPs pushed very hard for the deal to go through. Or, and even if they tried to frame it as, we just want this deal to be looked at properly, we don't like the process, we don't like the lack of transparency. What it meant was this thing ought to go through. So I think I would flag here as well, this points to the fact that influence isn't a one-way street. I think we sometimes have a very Eurocentric view of Europe should go to the Gulf or the Middle East. European politicians should go and influence positively. Well, we already know, in a sense, they are part of the problem, and that's been described today. Their political systems are, quite entrenched and in authoritarian regimes in the region. But there's also a two-way influence, and I don't think it's stretching it too much to say, if we look at a number of things in the UK that have happened recently. The laws that make it easier to strip citizenship, laws that make it, an offence to protest in a way that annoys people, the introduction of new migrant worker visas that tie you to your employer, including for domestic workers. Now, is this often put forward, the UK being a bad example to other countries? The UK is supposed to be the home of democracy and it's being a bad example. Or is it an element of importing, actually, models that we see elsewhere in the world from places that are economic and development miracles, in quotes? So I do think that there's a two-way process here. So I guess in summary, I think we are quite a long way from transformative moment that maybe, you know, we would like to see in this room of Western governments, you know, reconsidering and recalibrating these strategic partnerships with Gulf states, you know, to center human rights in those relationships in the way that, you know, Biden sort of gave us a sort of hint that he might do early on. But I think perhaps there is a chance for us to work, you know, more directly and highlight to the political establishments in Europe and North America how we are playing with fire. We're playing with fire with our sort of active support through military and security relationships. And I would very much include the sort of surveillance industry and as part of that, you know, which Marwa spoke about, through cultural partnerships that legitimize authoritarian regimes. I think those are really, really important. And the kind of red carpet legitimacy. And you know, that playing with fire has the really serious implications for our own democratic establishments and systems and our own kind of polities. And I think that's something I feel may have some kind of cut through with the policymakers over the long haul. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much, James, and thanks for making that argument that it's not just hypocritical from our governments to support or cooperate with these autocracies, but that it might in fact and in the long run be against their own interest of securing national security and economic prosperity. Next, I would like to go back to one of our speakers online, legal femina rights group Ramzi Qais. He litigates cases of human rights violations and conducts legal research on patterns of rights violations throughout the MENA region. And I believe he would like to speak a little bit on how to secure accountability through working with international legal mechanisms. I know MENA Rights Group works a lot with the UN human rights system, and potentially also coming back to what Marwa mentioned earlier, sanction mechanisms or international sanction regimes. Welcome.
Hi, Julia. Thank you for having me as part of this session and as part of Al-Qus's annual conference. It's a pleasure to be here. So in this part, I think I'd like to first highlight what I think are some challenges to accountability, particularly in the context of Saudi Arabia, and then to maybe delve into some of the strategies and avenues that can be utilized to pursue and secure various forms of accountability for human rights abuses. I think something that's been said throughout this conference by various panelists is that over the past years, it's clear that we have seen an alarming increase in the perpetuation of human rights violations and the persecution of human rights defenders, critics and political opponents, and particularly in Saudi Arabia. This continues to take place today with complete impunity. And if we take a closer look at Saudi Arabia and who exactly is responsible for the perpetuation of these human rights abuses, we find clearly that accountability at the domestic level is completely impossible to achieve because of the centralization of power held by the king and the crown prince, the lack of oversight over the country's state security apparatus, and the lack of independence of the judiciary. And this has become more apparent in recent years, particularly with the establishment in 2017 of the Presidency of State Security, the Public Prosecution Office, and the adoption of the 2017 counterterrorism law. And under this new counterterrorism law, the Presidency of State Security, the Public Prosecution Office, and the Specialized Criminal Court are rendered as just powerful tools of state repression that work together in both an interdependent and coordinated way in order to enable this systematic perpetuation of human rights violations, such as arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, and torture, which we have seen been systematically used against human rights defenders, peaceful critics, and just individuals exercising their fundamental freedoms, be it online or in the real world. And so because these institutions are controlled heavily by the executive, it's clear there's no accountability in sight at the domestic level. So I think here it's worth highlighting the various avenues for accountability that exist beyond the domestic level. And I think that something that's been touched upon by Marwa as well, is that in the recent years, we've seen the development of, or the enactment of laws across various countries and continents that establish targeted sanctions mechanisms against perpetrators of human rights violations. And this, I think, provides one form of accountability for these violations. So if we just look over the past 5 years, in 2016, the US Senate passed the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Act, which allows for the designation of sanctions, for sanctions to be placed against individuals responsible for gross human rights violations. And shortly after the enactment of the law, we saw 17 Saudi individuals who were involved in the brutal killing of Jamal Khashoggi being placed on that sanctions list. 1 year later, Canada adopted the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act. And just a year later, we also saw the inclusion of the same Saudi individuals on that list. The UK in 2020 adopted the Global Human Rights Sanctions Regulations, and here amongst the first people to be designated under the UK's Human Rights Sanctions Regulations were the Saudi individuals mentioned before. And in 2020 as well, the EU's Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy gave EU member states the powers to ban perpetrators of human rights violations from traveling in Europe, to freeze the assets of officials or organizations, companies or banks, and to outlaw Europeans from making funds available to those engaged in serious abuses. So this is all just to say that on the international level, we have seen in the last few years the emergence of new mechanisms that can be utilized to combat violations of human rights and hold those perpetrating those violations accountable. And I think that the adoption of these mechanisms provides civil society organizations, human rights lawyers, and activists with avenues to pursue accountability by filing complaints for sanctions against perpetrators. But this year as well, we've also seen the pursuit of perhaps more judicial forms of accountability, including through the use of universal jurisdiction. For example, just in March of this year, Reporters Without Borders filed a criminal complaint in a German court against MBS, Saud al-Qahtani, Maher Mutrib, and other Saudi officials, accusing them of committing crimes against humanity. And so time will tell what the results of such efforts will be. But of course, as we all know, human rights violations don't happen in a vacuum. They happen because they've been institutionalized, they've been normalized. And so how do we address these violations at a more holistic level, and what is needed here? And I think the question here is not only how we pursue accountability for individual violations of human rights, but also how to secure accountability and address patterns of human rights violations that exist at the holistic level in order to ensure that these patterns no longer take place. And this is something that I think Matthew brought up in his remarks. To prove there's a pattern of violation, this requires an intense level of documentation that is meticulous, extensive, detail-oriented. This includes documenting a large range of violations, looking at the individuals who are committing these violations, what institutions they belong to, the time, the place, the date of these violations, in addition to collecting evidence, testimonies, or credible sources that can attest to the nature of these violations. And this is necessary because this is necessary to highlight a pattern of violations taking place that is systematic, meaning that it is taking place with the approval or the acquiescence of high-level leaders, so that this documentation can then be used in order to establish a case for sanctions against certain individuals or bring them before a foreign court, and obviously preferably for those individuals who are at the head of the institutions that are perpetrating these human rights violations. And the second thing I'd like to point out in this part is that in the past recent years, and particularly with regards to Saudi Arabia, we have seen the adoption at the UN level of various decisions, opinions, and communications, which have shed light on the nature of violations taking place in the kingdom. But these documents, which are geared more towards achieving state-level accountability, seeing Saudi Arabia, the state, as the violator of human rights, can provide a valuable tool that can be used at some point in the future to ensure that individual perpetrators are held accountable. These documents, the communications, can also be used as credible sources in order to push for larger legal and policy reforms that are necessary to ensure the non-repetition of human rights violations. So as just an example, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, after receiving dozens of thoroughly documented cases of arbitrary detention over decades, reaffirmed this year in 2021 that in its 30-year history, it found Saudi Arabia to be in violation of its international human rights obligations in over 60 cases, which, according to the working group, indicates a widespread or systematic problem of arbitrary detention, and which, according to the working group, could amount to a serious violation of international law. And the working group on arbitrary detention has affirmed that widespread or systematic imprisonment may constitute a crime against humanity. Similarly, in 2020, the UN Working Group on Enforced Disappearance issued a general allegation against Saudi Arabia after receiving reports that, and I quote, "the practice of enforced disappearance in Saudi Arabia is widespread and systematic." And the Working Group on Enforced Disappearance concluded that the obstacles to the implementation of the 1992 Declaration on Enforced Disappearance are pervasive and deliberate and embedded in the legal, institutional, and policy framework of Saudi Arabia. And again, here, the working group reaffirmed that the practice of enforced disappearance could constitute a crimes against humanity. So I think that the fact that we have UN bodies which are credible and reputable sources that have acknowledged the widespread nature of these serious violations, human rights violations in Saudi Arabia, and have stated that these systematic crimes could amount to crimes against humanity is another valuable tool that can be used in the future to either sanction individuals or use it in foreign courts in order to file criminal complaints. So to sum up, I think in the end, despite the many rising and continuously rising obstacles to achieving accountability in Saudi Arabia, in the Gulf, maybe in the MENA region more generally, I think that also the past few years have provided us with very strategic tools, which may prove to be quite valuable in our pursuit of accountability and justice for human rights violations. And
thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ramzi, and thank you to all the speakers on this panel for their presentations. At this moment in time, I would like to open the floor to the audience here in the room for any questions. Or comments or suggestions of accountability.
Hello, my question is for James, actually. I think that you made a very interesting point when you talked about the importation of governments in places like the UK and the sort of pernicious influence that it can have on both the public and political sphere. I think that there are some precedents for this when we look at UK history as well, particularly when we think of long-standing conservative fantasies of Singapore on the Thames, or even going back to a few short years ago where it was still common to see a great deal of admiration for China and gushing reviews from expats who lived there talking about the pace in which that the country had modernized and also how high quality their life was. How do you feel that this importation from the Gulf is different from that, or possibly more dangerous?
Yes.
That's a great question. Well, I mean, by the way, just on the Singapore actually was an example I meant to mention. I think it's sort of in some way the thinking behind it, as you say, the sort of philosophical underpinnings are quite similar in terms of the appeal of that model. And of course, we know, for example, a lot of Gulf states have looked to Singapore as the model that they would like to follow. I saw recently Saudi. I mean, actually, you mentioned China, and I think China is obviously really, really important here. And I was very struck recently by a comment. It was quoted in the Financial Times. Some of you may have seen it. And it was a senior Saudi official, unnamed, saying that they were really interested in looking towards what China's doing. And the key point was that China's success is predicated on the fact it's not a democracy, which I think kind of sort of sums up, I think, the way in which this sort of effective autocracy, and I hesitate to use that phrase because Matthew is literally a scholar of authoritarianism, so he'll probably tell me that's the wrong phrase to use, but that sort of notion is, is spreading across. I think in terms of what's the difference between the Gulf model versus the Singapore model, or what's the difference? I mean, I think a critical difference is that simply the British bilateral relationship with Gulf states is so close. Bahrain might be an interesting example, okay, of where, many. I used to work in the Foreign Office, for full disclosure, a long time ago, and many former ambassadors go and subsequently work as advisors to the royal court. And we see similar sorts of relationships across the Gulf. There are personal relationships, business relationships, and of course the strategic defense and security relationships, and the agreements that exist. And it's not just Britain, also France, the agreements between governments that involve, kind of certain kinds of security guarantees that provide. So I think the exchange of ideas is likely to be swifter and maybe more influential, I think, between sort of elite establishments.
Thank you. Suidal from Al-Qist. Could you comment on the idea that because of this close interrelationship between the Brits and the Gulf, I read recently somebody explaining how the kafala system was originally introduced by the British in a nascent form. They got it from British in India and so on. So this is part of the British legacy in the Gulf. And another comment on the strong leader model, the strongman autocrat. Will the West not remember their support of the Shah of Iran and what a disaster that was for everybody?
Shall I take that first, and then if you want to? Yeah, on the kafala point, I am not going to claim to be a sort of student of the history of kafala, but I absolutely have had that conversation many times with people who. I think there are some people who argue it differently, but certainly there's a strong case for it, and I'm happy to accept it. If that is, but certainly I think it is very. I guess I would go to a sort of more contemporary point there, which is it is very difficult at the moment for any European or American or North American government to really critique the kafala system, given that their visa systems are. I've just been doing a big study on the employer-specific work permit in Canada, and the dynamics of that, whilst the context in Canada is very different, the dynamics for a migrant worker in Canada have many of the same fundamental things that leave you so at risk of abuse as you see in the Gulf states, because the fundamental is your residency status is tied to your employer. That leaves you with, it's almost impossible to sort of seek a grievance effectively, no matter how good the surrounding sort of infrastructure for that is. Just on, I guess I would just make, and I'm going to pass over to others on this, but just on the sort of the Shah point, I mean, I'm sure that people in this room have spent a lot of time trying to sort of make the case to, Western governments that, supporting authoritarians doesn't ultimately guarantee you, they can't provide stability. And lots of Western governments will say in their security strategies, dictators don't provide security. And we saw this obviously in 2011, I guess, I think that we had a fantastic piece written by Mohammed Lotfi, who's an Egyptian activist, talking about how his view is that the calculation of Europeans on this is that the short-term benefits that you can get from working with these leaders outweighs the sort of potential gains of a sort of difficult transition, and all the complexity involved with that. So that's my sense of what's happening there. It's just a short-termist approach.
The global shift towards, not towards, but away from democracy is it was summed up, I think, by a Gulf resident I spoke to once, which was, they said Russia's relationship with Syria was that they liked what they were doing in terms of supporting Bashar al-Assad to the nth degree, but they just didn't like the way they were doing it in terms of the barrel bombs and everything else. The idea is that order brings stability. You can see in Yemen, you can see in Libya and other states, there are quite clear structures and like an archetypal cake press, or whatever you want to call it. These people are socially conservative, but they also have a very strong military and security background. And this is then replicated over and over again in many domains and areas. The only problem is that the stronger that these people are, in theory, the weaker society and the state's controllers, the more scared of people, the less accurate their pulse is. And so the more dangerous things become, not only for the incumbent, but also for society, because they can't peacefully leave office. And I think we've seen that with the hotel, the anti-corruption drive in Saudi Arabia and others across the Gulf. The what they're playing for is nearly a zero-sum game for everyone involved. And this is the very dangerous end game.
Thank you. I think we had another question.
بمناسبة هذا اللقاء نتكلم الآن في الخليج العربي، كنت أتمنى هذا المؤتمر وهذا اللقاء يكون باللغة العربية لكي يستفيد الناس ما وراء الشاشة، الملايين من الناس. فبهذه المناسبة أحب أستذكر الشهيد حسن البشار الذي قتل في 2018 إجراء العنف في عمان. فحبيت أستذكر الشهيد المناضل، وأتمنى في المؤتمرات القادمة أن تكون باللغة العربية لكي يستفيد أكبر قدر من الناس، لأن احنا موجودين في بلد حرية بإمكاننا أن نتكلم بأريحية، لكن نريد أن نوصل معلومة للناس في الداخل الذي لا توصل كثير، خاصة في سلطنة عمان. الإعلام مغطي بشكل كامل على قضايا المرأة، العنف ضد عاملات المنازل، العنف الأسري والاختفاء القسري الذي نعاني منه في عمان من الحكم.
Thank you very much for that comment from our Omani friend, and I think this is definitely something we'll take into consideration, translation into Arabic for our next conference. Thank you very much.
He actually wants to he talks about Hassan al-Bashar. He's an Omani activist who died in Omani prison. And he actually talked about lots of points. I cannot remember all of them, but one of them actually he just asked if the next conference can be in Arabic, so the message can reach to the Arabic audience in our countries, as we are staying or living in a free country, according to his what he said. More questions? Oh.
Honestly, my point just I want to clarify something for us. As you mentioned, how the governments supporting other governments outside, especially in our case, unfortunately, in October, from military, they stopped our revolution with something 2019. So how do you see the situation like that supporting military government of Sudan? Yes, taking sort of fight Yemen, and also European, appreciate European question how they support civilian.
Yeah, usually. I think that maybe James would like to offer some comments, and I would also obviously like to give our speakers online the opportunity if they want to comment after.
Yeah, I'm happy
No,
to
of
as
course.
well. Yeah, I think I think it's interesting how much time Europe and America talk about Iran's regional meddling, and yet we hear very little. If you look at, for example, 2013 and the overthrow of Morsi by Sisi, the backing by Abu Dhabi for Haftar in Libya, and Sudan now. There is a clear pattern, and I mean, interesting example of Libya. There is pretty clear evidence of breaches of UN arms embargoes by the Emiratis that in that case, and yet we see no unified kind of narrative from Western governments around what this meddling by their allies in support of authoritarianism, in the broader region. And I think Sudan, which I don't want to sort of comment too much on the detail because I don't have the expertise or the knowledge, but it seems fairly clear to me that the role, there are some similarities with what we've seen in other parts of the Middle East and North Africa. And I think, I think when we look at the sort of European and American kind of response, I think there's a fairly typical picture where they will tend to say the right thing. But do we see a sense of consequence that's attached to that? A consequence for a military who chooses to overthrow a civilian government, or a president, who chooses to close down parliament, for example, as the sort of thing we've seen in Tunisia. Is there a clear sense? I mean, if you look at Tunisia, what's interesting to me is, the EU is by far Tunisia's biggest trade partner. And yet it seems somehow that the EU's efforts to engage on the very, very serious kind of constitutional and human rights issues that have been raised in the past few months have not got very far. And I would argue that some of that is about failure to link these normative messages to actual consequences, and to make those consequences feel real. And I think that the examples of where you see that things have been achieved, or where Europeans and Americans have been able to kind of, make some kind of positive impact, either on a sort of individual level or on a policy level, is where there is some sense that there's actual consequences. So that's, I think, what I would be interested to sort of know more about in Sudan, how that's played out.
I think the second mic is not working, so we couldn't hear the questions. So if you want to paraphrase that for us, we would appreciate it. And now I think we can't hear anything. Can you, Ramzi?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry, can you please paraphrase the question? We couldn't hear it.
You didn't hear the question from the audience?
Yeah, yes. The microphone is not working.
The question in summary was, we're looking at the role of Sudan and regional involvement in meddling in Sudan. How is this representative of other events and undermining it to a certain degree?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment. I mean, now that it's been a decade since the Arab uprisings, it's very clear that any attempt at democratization or revolution led by people constitutes an existential threat to the monarchies in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And that's why pretty much since 2011, we've seen the restriction, or how restrictions over freedom of expression, association, assembly, civil society work has been intensified. We've talked about surveillance, and I'm sure in this conference, a lot of these violations have been discussed at length. I think that's the number one threat to these monarchies, and therefore it's not a surprise nor a hidden fact that they have been meddling in the trajectory, so to speak, of events or political events in Sudan, in Tunisia, and elsewhere. And here, probably from a digital rights perspective, I can speak about the spread of disinformation networks and the use of social media platforms towards these political ends, and how in some cases, and it's well documented, I don't have examples at the top of my head right now, but UAE sanctioned or Saudi sanctioned social media networks, disinformation networks, whose purpose is to sway public conversations and narratives in the region one way or the other, of course, towards serving the political purposes and interests of these two monarchies. And so I think the current situation in Sudan, it's yet to be seen, as people are still protesting on the streets. But if we want to look and analyze what's happening in Sudan, in Tunisia, we can't analyze or understand the different scenarios of what could happen without looking at the bigger picture and without looking at the role of Saudi Arabia and the UAE and, of course, a bunch of other countries in the Gulf in these political processes. And I think we lost them.
To hold politicians to account for their promises of promoting international human rights and democracy and the rule of law. But obviously also civil responsibility. I think we've heard need for campaigning and continued advocacy, and to a certain extent maybe a moral responsibility, specifically when it comes to sports people or celebrities or others that are currently partially having the authorities to whitewash their image, corporate responsibility for sure as well, for companies engaging with Saudi Arabia not to be complicit in human rights violations. And I think what we can see, the human rights situation throughout the region remains problematic, but there are definitely lots of sparks of hope. And I think the previous sessions have very well demonstrated that. One example I think that Rothna made, that the human rights activism of the Saudi women has really kind of spread through the region and inspired others to take that up, be that in Qatar or other countries. And I think we have also really a new, very active generation of activists from these countries, active in the diaspora and really advancing and on behalf of for attending this conference. Of course, a big thank you to all as well as to our audience here in the room and also watching online. Wishing you a happy Human Rights Day. It continues. Thank you. Very end, yeah.